When my daughter Janelle passed away from breast cancer, my son-in-law Blake kicked me out of my own house, threw my bags into the street, and shouted, "You useless old nigger, go live with the other welfare bums where you belong." I said, "Blake, please. Janelle would want—" And he slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. I tried to hold back my tears because just hours earlier, we had buried my only child. Before I continue this story, my name is George. Before I continue, subscribe to the channel and comment what city you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth because of your age or race. My name is George Washington Carter. I'm 76 years old, a retired history teacher who spent 40 years educating young minds in Atlanta public schools. I never imagined that the day I buried my daughter would be just the beginning of my nightmare. The funeral had ended at 5 p.m. It was small and quiet, just how Janelle would have wanted it. She was always the type who preferred intimate gatherings, even in death. I stood by her casket, placing a single white rose on the polished wood, my hand trembling, my heart shattered into pieces I knew would never fit back together. She looked peaceful, finally free from the cancer that had destroyed her body over 2 brutal years. Blake stood beside me during the service, his face cold and distant. He'd been that way for months during Janelle's illness, increasingly impatient, increasingly calculating. I'd attributed it to grief, to the stress of watching his wife die. But there were moments when I caught something else in his eyes, something that made my blood run cold, something that whispered of the storm that was coming. We returned to what had been my home for 3 years in Cascade Heights, a beautiful brick house in a historically black, middle-class neighborhood. The kind of place my parents could only dream about when they were raising me in the projects of Southwest Atlanta in the 1950s. Janelle had insisted I move in with them after my heart episode back in 2022. "Daddy, you need family around you," she'd said, her voice already weakened by chemotherapy. "Besides, this house is too big for just Blake and me." I had resisted at first, not wanting to be a burden. I was a retired history teacher living on a modest pension after 40 years educating young minds about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Moving in with them made financial sense, and more importantly, it gave me precious time with my daughter during what turned out to be her final years on this earth. The house was filled with the usual post-funeral awkwardness that afternoon. Neighbors bringing casseroles, nobody would eat, distant relatives making small talk. Nobody meant everyone avoiding eye contact while they picked at sandwiches and spoke in hushed tones about what a wonderful person Janelle had been. By 6 o'clock, the last guest had left. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive, like the air before a tornado touches down. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't dwell on the fact that my only child was gone when Blake appeared in the doorway. Something about his posture made me freeze, the dish towel still in my hands. His arms were crossed, his expression carrying a coldness I'd never seen directed at me before. In that moment, I knew. I knew that whatever came next would change everything. "George, we need to talk," he said, his voice flat and final, the way you'd talk to a stranger, not family. I set down the plate and turned to face him, my 76-year-old heart already starting to race with a fear I didn't yet understand. "Of course, Blake. I know this is hard for both of us. Janelle wouldn't want us to—" "Cut the crap," he interrupted, and the venom in his voice made me take a step back. "Janelle's gone. Things are going to change around here." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm October evening. "What do you mean?" Blake leaned against the doorframe, and for the first time I noticed he'd already loosened his funeral tie, already shed the pretense of mourning. There was something predatory in his stance, something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. "I mean, you can't stay here anymore, old man. This is my house now, and I don't need some useless old man taking up space, eating my food, running up my utilities." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself, my 76-year-old knees suddenly feeling weak beneath me. "Blake, I don't understand. Janelle wanted me here. She made me promise I'd stay, that I'd make this my home. She said—" Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a sound I'd never heard from the man who'd called me Pops for 5 years, who'd sat at my table for Sunday dinners, who'd smiled in all those family photos. "Janelle's dead," he snapped, his voice rising, now echoing off the kitchen walls. What she wanted doesn't matter anymore. This is reality, George. I've got my own life to live, and it doesn't include playing nursemaid to some pathetic old man who can't even take care of himself. My mouth went dry. The room seemed to tilt. But where would I go? This has been my home for 3 years. My things, my photos of Janelle, my... Blake laughed again, crueler this time, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Or maybe it had always been there, hidden behind the mask he wore when Janelle was alive. Your things. What things? A bunch of old clothes and dusty books. Some worthless photo albums of a dead woman. Give me a break, George. You've got nothing. You are nothing. Then he said it. The word that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. The word that revealed who Blake Morrison really was beneath the progressive facade. Just another broke, useless old nigger looking for a handout. The slur hung in the air between us like poison. In all the years Blake had been married to my daughter, through all the family dinners and holidays and birthday celebrations, he'd never shown this side of himself. He'd been the progressive white man who'd married a black woman, who'd talked about social justice and equality at dinner parties, who'd posted the right things on social media. But now, with Janelle barely cold in the ground, his true face was showing ugly and hateful and real. I need you out tonight, Blake continued, his voice taking on a threatening edge that made my heart pound even harder. Pack your bags and get out. Go live in a shelter or on the street for all I care. Just get the hell out of my house. Blake, please. I tried one more time, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of this cruelty. At least give me a few days to find somewhere to go. I'm an old man. I have a heart condition. I can't just... Not my problem, he said, pulling out his phone and checking it casually, as if we were discussing something as mundane as taking out the trash. You've got 2 hours. If you're not gone by then, I'm calling the police and telling them there's an intruder in my home. Try explaining that to the cops when they show up and see an old black man refusing to leave a white man's house. The threat was clear. In 2025, in Atlanta, Georgia, an old black man and the police was still a dangerous combination. Blake knew it, I knew it, and he was willing to use it against me. With legs feeling like lead, with my whole world collapsing around me, I dragged myself upstairs to the small bedroom that had been mine for 3 years. My hands trembled as I pulled out 2 old suitcases from the closet and began to pack. Each item felt impossibly heavy, weighted with memories I wasn't ready to let go of. A photo of Janelle and me at her college graduation from Spelman, both of us beaming with pride. Her first finger painting from kindergarten, a mess of colors that I'd kept for 43 years. The watch she'd given me for my 50th birthday engraved with, "To the best dad in the world." I could hear Blake downstairs already on the phone with someone, his voice lighter, now almost cheerful. Yeah, finally getting rid of the old man tonight. No, he won't be a problem. Just some pathetic old fool with nowhere to go. His laughter drifted up the stairs, each sound a fresh wound. When I came back downstairs with my 2 suitcases, everything I owned in the world reduced to what could fit in those worn leather bags, Blake was waiting by the open front door. He was tapping his foot impatiently, like I was inconveniencing him with my very existence, with my audacity to take time gathering my belongings. About time, he muttered, not even looking at me. Now get out, and don't ever come back. And George, if I see you around this neighborhood, if you try to contact me, if you tell anyone any lies about what happened here tonight, I'll make sure you regret it. Understood? As I stepped onto the porch, dragging my suitcases behind me, I turned one last time. The house where my daughter had lived and died, where I'd cared for her during her final months, where I'd thought I'd found a home in my old age. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the walkway. Blake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, all the fight gone out of me. Janelle loved you. She would be heartbroken to see what you've become. She would be ashamed of... The door slammed in my face so hard, it rattled the windows, cutting off my words, cutting off any last connection to the life I'd known. I stood there for a moment, 2 suitcases at my feet, a 76-year-old black man who'd just been thrown out of his home with racist slurs by his white son-in-law. Mrs. Patterson from next door was watching from her window. I caught her eye, and for a moment I thought she might come outside, might say something, might offer help. We'd been neighbors, friendly, had waved to each other countless times, but instead she pulled her curtains closed. Even she, a black woman who'd lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, couldn't bear to witness my shame. Or maybe she was afraid of what helping me might cost her. Either way, I was alone. I loaded my suitcases into my 2010 Honda Civic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the handles. It was 7:30 in the evening. The sun was setting over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That would have been beautiful if I'd been able to see anything through my tears, through the fog of shock and grief and disbelief that clouded my vision. I had nowhere to go. No family left except the man who'd just thrown me out like garbage. No close friends who could take me in on such short notice. My modest teacher's pension of $1,200 a month barely covered basic expenses, certainly not enough for a security deposit on an apartment, not enough to start over at 76 years old. That night I slept in my car in a Walmart parking lot off Cascade Road. I used my jacket as a blanket against the October chill and my suitcase as a pillow. The parking lot lights hummed overhead, harsh and fluorescent, a constant reminder that I was exposed, vulnerable, no longer invisible. Every so often a car would pull in headlights, sweeping across my windshield, and I would duck down, not wanting anyone to see, not wanting to become another statistic, another old black man sleeping rough, another invisible elder that society had forgotten. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees that night. My arthritis flared up, sending sharp pains through my knees and hands, through joints that were already worn from 76 years of living. My heart, still weak from that episode 3 years ago, beat irregularly in my chest, skipping beats reminding me that I was old, that I was fragile, that I might not survive what was coming. I thought about Janelle constantly through that long, cold night, about how proud she had been when she married Blake 5 years ago. He's ambitious, Daddy, she'd told me, her eyes shining with love and hope. He's going to make something of himself. He's different from other people. He sees me, really sees me, not just my color. I had wanted to believe her, had wanted to believe that love could transcend race, that her white husband truly valued her, and by extension valued me. But Blake had waited. He had been patient. He had waited until Janelle was gone, until I was at my most vulnerable, until there were no witnesses except Mrs. Patterson, who would rather close her curtains than help an elderly black man being abused. As I finally drifted off to an uncomfortable sleep around midnight, shivering in my car, my last thought was a question that would haunt me for weeks to come. How would I explain this to Janelle? If she could see me now thrown out like garbage on the day of her funeral, sleeping in a car in a parking lot discarded by the man she'd loved and trusted, how would I tell my brilliant, beautiful daughter that her husband had shown his true racist face the moment she was no longer there to see it? I had no answers that night. Only questions. Only pain. Only the cold reality of a 76-year-old black man learning that even in 2025, even in Atlanta, even after everything we'd fought for and won racism, still thrived behind closed doors and smiling faces. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly imagine as I shivered in that Walmart parking lot, was that this nightmare was just the beginning of a story that would take me from homelessness to a truth so shocking it would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my life, my father, and my worth. 3 weeks had passed since Blake threw me out, and I barely recognized the man I had become. My reflection in store windows showed someone hollow-eyed and gaunt, someone who had lost at least 20 pounds, someone who looked every bit the homeless person Blake had accused me of being. My clothes hung loose on my frame. My hair had gone completely gray, seemingly overnight, and there was a defeated slump to my shoulders that hadn't been there before. The Riverside shelter on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive became my new reality. The irony wasn't lost on me, a street named after the man who'd fought for our dignity, leading me to a place where dignity went to die. My days had settled into a grim routine that would have been unimaginable just a month before. Wake up at 5:30 when the fluorescent lights flickered on with a harsh buzz that jolted everyone from whatever restless sleep we'd managed to find. The shelter staff would walk through the rows of cots, calling out in voices that tried to be kind but came out tired. Time to get up, folks. Beds need to be cleared by 7. We'd fold our thin blankets, stack them on the metal cots that had left permanent bruises on my bony hips, and shuffle toward the doors like prisoners being released for the day. Spend the day wandering the streets of Atlanta, looking for odd jobs that paid cash, anything to earn a few dollars for food or to save toward something better. Return to the shelter by 6 o'clock to get in line for dinner and hopefully secure a bed for the night. If you came back any later than 6:15, you'd be sleeping on the floor or outside on the street. At 76, with a bad heart and arthritis that flared up in the October cold, I couldn't risk that. The shelter itself was a converted warehouse, clean enough but crowded beyond what any building should hold. Cots were arranged in rows like a military barracks, maybe 80 of them packed into a space that felt barely big enough for 40 people. The thin mattresses, no more than 2 inches of foam, offered little comfort against the metal frames that dug into hip bones and shoulder blades. But it was warm, it was dry, and at 76 years old, with nowhere else to go, I had learned not to be picky about small mercies. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the constant gnawing of hunger when I couldn't afford to eat. It was the sounds at night that haunted me. The man in the cot next to me, a younger guy, maybe in his 50s, named Gerald, had a cough that never stopped. Deep, rattling wet. The kind of cough that spoke of untreated pneumonia or tuberculosis or something worse that was slowly killing him from the inside. He'd hack through the night violent spasms that shook his whole body, and I'd lie there in the darkness wondering if whatever he had was contagious, if I'd catch it, if that's how my story would end. Across the room, someone cried quietly into their pillow almost every night. Soft, broken sobs that cut through the darkness like a knife. I never saw who it was, never wanted to intrude on their private grief, but those sounds became the soundtrack of my existence. These were the sounds of broken lives, of dreams deferred and destroyed, of dignity discarded like yesterday's trash. During the day when I wasn't looking for work, I tried calling old friends from my teaching days. People I'd worked with for decades, colleagues who'd attended my retirement party just 6 years ago with cake and speeches about what a difference I'd made in young people's lives. Tom Henderson, who I'd known for 20 years, who'd taught math in the classroom right next to mine at Douglas High School, actually hung up on me when I mentioned needing a place to stay temporarily. "Sorry, George, but we've got our own problems," was all he said before the line went dead. The dial tone felt like a final judgment on my worth. Janet Williams, my former principal, was more polite but equally unhelpful. "Oh, George, I wish I could help, but you know how it is. We barely have room for ourselves, and with the economy the way it is, with our daughter moving back home." Her voice trailed off into the familiar territory of excuses I'd heard before. Excuses that all meant the same thing. "You're on your own." I could hear the relief in her voice when I said I understood and let her off the hook. I tried 3 more people from my old life. Carl from the teachers' union, who I'd worked with on contract negotiations for 15 years. Patricia, who'd organized the Black History Month programs with me every February, who'd called me a mentor and a friend. Even Dennis, who I'd mentored when he was a new teacher fresh out of Morehouse College, who'd told me I'd changed his life. All of them had reasons why they couldn't help. All of them sounded vaguely embarrassed, eager to end the conversation and get back to their comfortable lives where homelessness was something that happened to other people. The truth was, people were afraid. Homelessness made them uncomfortable, forced them to confront how thin the line was between security and destitution. It was easier to believe I had done something to deserve this fate than to acknowledge that it could happen to anyone, that it could happen to them if they made one wrong turn or trusted the wrong person. At night, lying on my cot, listening to Gerald cough and the anonymous person cry, listening to the sounds of 80 broken lives trying to rest in one crowded room. I thought about my 40 years of teaching history. I taught at Douglas High School from 1978 to 2018. 4 decades of shaping young minds, of teaching black students about Frederick Douglass, who'd escaped slavery to become one of our greatest voices. About Harriet Tubman, who'd risked her life 19 times to lead 300 people to freedom. About Rosa Parks, who'd said no to injustice on that bus in Montgomery. About Martin Luther King Jr., who'd dreamed of a day when we'd be judged by our character, not our color. I'd taught them that we as black people had survived slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, discrimination, violence, and systemic racism. That we were resilient, that we were strong, that we could overcome anything if we held on to our dignity and our humanity. I remembered faces now in the darkness. Marcus Johnson, who'd gone on to become a doctor at Emory Hospital. Tamika Brown, now a civil rights lawyer in Washington, D.C. Gerald Williams. Yeah, same first name as my cot neighbor who'd become a teacher himself and was carrying on the work. I'd received Christmas cards from former students for years after I retired. Letters telling me how I'd changed their lives, how I'd made them believe they could succeed, despite all the obstacles in their path. But lying on that cot in Riverside Shelter, I didn't feel like someone who'd made a difference. I felt like exactly what Blake had called me. Useless, old, worthless. Just another broke old man that nobody wanted around. It was Pete Johnson who brought me the first real news about Blake and what was happening at the house that used to be my home. Pete was a handyman in his mid-50s who did odd jobs around Cascade Heights, and he had always been friendly with me during the years I lived there. I ran into him at a community center on Auburn Avenue where I was eating a free lunch provided by a local church. Watery vegetable soup and stale crackers, but it was food, and I was grateful for it. George Pete said, sitting down across from me at the long folding table. His face showed genuine concern, which was more than I'd gotten from most people. "Man, I've been worried about you. Heard some things from the neighborhood. Wanted to find you and let you know what's going on." I set down my spoon, my appetite gone despite my constant hunger. "What kind of things?" Pete leaned forward, lowering his voice even though the community center was nearly empty at this hour. "I've been doing some work for the neighbors next to your old house, the Pattersons. I couldn't help but notice what's been going on over there at Blake's place." My stomach tightened at the mention of Blake's name. "What's going on? Blake's throwing everything out, George. Had a big dumpster delivered last week, one of those industrial-sized ones. I've seen him tossing out photo albums, furniture, women's clothing, artwork, quilts. Looks like he's clearing house, completely erasing every trace of Janelle from that place." My heart clenched so hard it hurt. Those were Janelle's things. Her books that she'd collected since childhood. Her artwork from high school that I'd framed and hung on the walls. The quilts her grandmother had made by hand, family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. The African art she'd collected from her trip to Ghana 2 years before she got sick. All of it treated like garbage, thrown away as if her life had meant nothing, as if she'd never existed. "There's more." Pete continued, his expression pained. "I've seen him with a woman. Blonde, white, real put-together looking, expensive clothes. They've been there together multiple times over the past week. Last Tuesday I saw them loading boxes into a U-Haul truck. She seemed to be moving her stuff in George, moving into Janelle's house, into Janelle's bedroom probably. 3 weeks, I whispered, my voice breaking. "It's been 3 weeks since we buried my daughter, and he's already got someone else living in her house." Pete nodded, his eyes full of sympathy. "I'm sorry, George. I thought you should know. Thought you deserved to know what kind of man Blake really is." After Pete left, I sat there for a long time, staring at my half-eaten bowl of soup that had gone cold. Blake was already moving on, replacing Janelle's memory with someone new, erasing every trace of my daughter from the house where she had lived and died and dreamed of growing old. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since we'd lowered her into the ground, and he was already bringing another woman into their home, sleeping in their bed, living the life he'd planned with my daughter, but with someone else in her place. That afternoon, I sat on a bench in Riverside Park, watching families play with their children on the playground, watching young couples walk hand in hand along the paths, watching a world that seemed to be moving forward while I was stuck in place. The autumn sun was warm on my face, but I felt cold inside, frozen by the knowledge that my daughter's memory was being erased as thoroughly and cruelly as I had been erased from her home. An elderly black woman sat down beside me on the bench, and I noticed she was carefully unwrapping a sandwich from aluminum foil. She must have been in her 70s like me, but she carried herself with a dignity and grace that I felt I had lost somewhere between Blake's front door and this park bench. "You look hungry, dear," she said softly, her voice kind and grandmotherly, the first gentle voice I'd heard in what felt like forever. "Here, take half of this. I always pack too much anyway." I wanted to refuse to maintain some shred of pride to prove that I wasn't completely helpless, but my stomach betrayed me with a loud, embarrassing growl. The soup from lunch had been hours ago and hadn't filled me up anyway. "Thank you," I whispered, accepting the food with hands that trembled slightly. It was turkey and cheese on wheat bread, simple but fresh, and it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for this kindness." "No thanks needed," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Ruth Jackson. I volunteer at First Baptist Church down on Auburn Avenue. You're welcome to come by for lunch tomorrow if you'd like. We serve every day at noon, and there's always plenty of food and no questions asked." For the first time in 3 weeks, someone had shown me kindness, without expecting anything in return, without judgment, without making me feel like a burden. I had to fight back tears that suddenly threatened to spill over. "I'm George," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. "George Carter, and yes, I'd like that very much. Thank you, Mrs. Jackson." Ruth studied my face for a moment, her eyes narrowing with recognition. "Wait a minute, I thought I recognized you. You used to teach at Douglas High School, didn't you? My grandson was in your history class about 10 years ago. Marcus Jackson. Tall boy, played basketball, always asking questions about the civil rights movement." The memory came flooding back, bringing with it a reminder of who I used to be, of the life I'd had before everything fell apart. Marcus had been a good student, bright and eager to learn, full of questions about how change happened and how ordinary people could make a difference. I'd spent extra time with him after school, helping him prepare for his college applications. "I've always believed education is the key to breaking cycles," I said, and for the first time in weeks I felt like myself again, like the teacher I had been before Blake's cruelty had stripped away my sense of purpose. Marcus was one of the good ones. Smart, curious, cared about making the world better. "Still is," Ruth said, her smile widening with pride. "Marcus graduated from Morehouse College, got his MBA from Emory, and now he works as a financial analyst downtown at one of the big firms. He's doing real well for himself. And he never forgot the teacher who believed in him when nobody else did, who stayed after school to help him, who wrote that letter of recommendation that got him his scholarship. He still talks about you, Mr. Carter." We talked for a while longer, and when Ruth stood to leave, she pressed a $20 bill into my hand. "For emergencies," she said firmly when I tried to refuse, closing my fingers around the money. "And I'll see you tomorrow at First Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue. Ask for Pastor David Williams. Tell him Ruth sent you. He's a good man, and he'll make sure you're taken care of." That night at the shelter, lying on my cot with Gerald coughing beside me and the anonymous person crying across the room, I counted that $20 bill as if it were a fortune. It was more money than I'd had at one time since Blake had thrown me out. I could buy a decent meal tomorrow, maybe get some toiletries from the dollar store, perhaps even a new shirt from the thrift shop so I wouldn't look quite so much like a homeless man when I went to the church. The next day I walked to First Baptist Church, a beautiful old brick building with a tall steeple that had been serving Atlanta's black community since the 1800s. Auburn Avenue had deep historical significance, the street where Dr. King had preached, where black businesses had thrived even during segregation, where our community had built power and dignity and hope despite a system designed to keep us down. Pastor David Williams was a man in his mid-60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a firm handshake that conveyed both strength and welcome. "Ruth told me about you, Brother George," he said, and the way he called me brother made something tight in my chest loosen just a little. "She says you're a good man, going through a hard time. Well, we've got plenty of those around here, and we do our best to help however we can." The church was serving lunch to about 50 people in the fellowship hall, a mix of homeless individuals like me and working poor families who couldn't quite make ends meet. The food was simple but hot and plentiful, the kind of soul food that reminded me of Sunday dinners with my mother when I was young before the world got so complicated. Fried chicken that was crispy on the outside and tender inside. Collard greens cooked with ham hocks, macaroni and cheese that was creamy and rich, cornbread that was sweet and crumbly, sweet tea so cold it made your teeth ache. Food made with love by church volunteers who understood that a hot meal could mean the difference between despair and hope. After lunch, as I was getting ready to leave and face another long afternoon with nowhere to go and nothing to do, Pastor Williams approached me again. "Brother George, I could use some help around here if you're interested. Nothing fancy or complicated, just sweeping the steps, keeping the property clean, helping set up chairs for services and events, that kind of thing. I can pay $50 a day, cash money. It's not much, I know, but it's honest work, and you'd be helping the church serve our community better." "I'd be honored, Pastor," I said, and I meant it with everything in me. Honest work, dignity, purpose. Things I'd thought I'd lost forever when Blake had thrown me out and called me worthless. So I started working at First Baptist Church. Every morning I'd leave the shelter at 7 o'clock when they made us clear out, and I'd walk the 2 miles to the church, arriving before 8. I'd spend the day maintaining the property, sweeping the front steps until they gleamed, picking up trash from the parking lot and the surrounding sidewalks, helping set up for Bible study on Wednesday nights and choir practice on Thursday evenings. Pastor Williams treated me with respect, always calling me Brother George, always making sure I ate lunch with everyone else, always asking if I needed to take breaks when he noticed me moving slower because of my arthritis. It wasn't much, but it was something. $50 a day, 5 days a week, meant $250 at the end of each week. It meant I could eat better than watery soup and stale crackers. It meant I could save a little bit, maybe enough to eventually afford a room somewhere, a place of my own where I wouldn't have to listen to Gerald's cough or the anonymous crying or wake up to fluorescent lights at 5:30 every morning. More importantly, it gave me back a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning beyond just surviving another day. The other volunteers at the church, mostly older black women like Ruth, who had wisdom in their eyes and kindness in their hearts, treated me with warmth and acceptance. They didn't ask intrusive questions about how I'd ended up homeless or what had gone wrong in my life. They simply accepted me as I was, offering fellowship and support without judgment, welcoming me into their community as if I'd always belonged there. But at night, lying on my cot at the shelter with $50 in cash hidden in my shoe because you couldn't trust anyone in a place like this, I still thought about Blake. About how he was living in comfort in the house my daughter had loved, entertaining his new blonde girlfriend, throwing away Janelle's belongings like they meant nothing, like she had meant nothing. About how he had thrown me away with the same casual cruelty, using racial slurs and contempt, revealing the racism that had been hiding beneath his progressive facade all along. I wondered if there was any justice in a world where a man could abuse an elder, use the N-word, discard someone like trash, and face no consequences. If Blake would ever pay for what he'd done to me, for how he'd dishonored Janelle's memory, for the cruelty and racism he'd shown. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly imagined as I drifted off to sleep that night with Gerald coughing beside me, was that karma was already in motion. That Blake's attempt to find hidden assets to pay his gambling debts had uncovered something he never expected, something that would send him into a panic and change both our lives forever. Tomorrow would bring news that would turn my understanding of my entire life upside down. Tomorrow would change everything. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after Blake had thrown me out, when Ruth found me sweeping the church steps. I'd gotten into a rhythm with the work, finding something meditative about the repetitive motion, the way the broom cleared away leaves and dirt to reveal clean stone beneath. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress, like I was making something better, even if it was just a set of steps. Ruth was hurrying up the walkway with an urgency I hadn't seen before, her usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked like a mixture of excitement and concern. Her eyes were bright, her pace quick despite her age, and I knew immediately that whatever news she carried was significant. "George," she called out, slightly breathless from her hurry, "I have some information you might find interesting. It's about Blake." I stopped sweeping and leaned the broom against the church wall, my heart rate picking up instinctively. Any news about Blake couldn't be good, but Ruth's expression suggested this was something different, something important that I needed to hear. "What kind of information?" Ruth glanced around the empty church grounds to make sure we were alone, then lowered her voice to just above a whisper. "My nephew Kevin works at Morrison & Associates downtown. It's one of the biggest law firms in Atlanta, handles everything from corporate law to estate planning to family matters. He's been there as a paralegal for 8 years, now knows the ins and outs of how everything works." I nodded, wondering where this was going, feeling a knot of tension forming in my stomach. Yesterday afternoon, Ruth continued, a man named Blake Morrison came into their office. Kevin said he was in what could only be described as a state of extreme agitation. Pacing, couldn't sit still, kept interrupting the lawyers with questions before they could finish answering the previous ones. Blake was at a law firm. I felt my mouth go dry. What was he there for? That's what caught Kevin's attention. Ruth said, her eyes searching my face. Blake was asking very specific and unusual questions about inheritance laws and something about biological parentage and proving family relationships. Kevin said it wasn't the normal kind of estate business they usually handle. Biological parentage, I repeated, confused my mind, trying to make sense of why Blake would be asking about that. Why would he be asking about that? Janelle is gone. We never had any questions about family relationships while she was alive. I'm her father, she was my daughter, that was never in question. That's exactly what made Kevin pay attention and remember the details Ruth explained. It wasn't normal. This Blake fellow kept mentioning something about a mistake, about how he'd acted too hastily on something important. He was asking the lawyers if there were ways to contest biological parentage after someone had died, or to verify family connections that might have been hidden or altered decades ago. He seemed desperate to find some kind of loophole or solution. The knot in my stomach tightened. What else did Kevin hear? Ruth pulled a small notepad from her purse, flipping to a page where she'd written notes. Kevin said Blake had apparently received some kind of official document that had upset him greatly. He kept pulling papers out of an envelope and showing them to the lawyers, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold them steady. The lawyers were trying to calm him down, asking him to explain the situation more clearly so they could understand what he needed. But Blake kept interrupting with more frantic questions. What kind of questions? Questions about how to locate someone who might be homeless, about emergency guardianship procedures, about whether there were legal ways to undo decisions he'd made recently. Kevin said the man looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, he needed a shave, and his eyes had this wild, desperate look. Kevin's worked with a lot of stressed clients over the years, but he said this was different. This was panic. I stood there trying to process what Ruth was telling me, trying to understand why Blake would be panicking about biological parentage and family relationships. None of it made sense. Unless, did Kevin hear anything else? Anything about me specifically? Ruth nodded. He heard Blake say your name several times, George Carter, and he heard him asking about how to find someone who might be staying in homeless shelters in Atlanta. 2 days later, I was sweeping the church parking lot when Pete Johnson found me. He'd come straight from a job site, still wearing his work clothes, and his face carried that same grave expression I'd seen before when he had news about Blake. "George, I need to tell you something else," Pete said without preamble, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "Something strange happened at your old house yesterday. Actually, a lot of strange things have been happening there, but yesterday was different, more intense." I set down my broom, my hands suddenly feeling unsteady. "What happened?" Pete took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "I was doing some repair work for the Pattersons next door, replacing some boards on their back deck. From there, I had a clear view of Blake's driveway and front entrance. Around noon, official-looking cars started showing up one after another like some kind of parade. What kind of official cars? That's what caught my attention," Pete said. "First one was from the county assessor's office, had the seal right on the door. Then another car pulled up from a law firm, looked like it had Morrison and Associates printed on the side, same firm my cousin works for downtown. But the one that really made me stop and watch was from a private investigation company. Heritage Investigations, it said on the side. I'd never heard of them before, but they looked professional, expensive. Private investigators. My heart began to race faster. Why would Blake need private investigators? "That's not even the strangest part, George," Pete continued, his voice dropping lower. "Around 12:30, after all these official people had been going in and out of the house for about an hour, this fancy black sedan pulls up. Real expensive-looking car, probably cost more than I make in a year. Out steps this woman in an expensive business suit, probably in her 50s, carrying a leather briefcase. She looked professional, powerful, like someone you don't mess with. I watched as she marched right up to the front door where Blake was standing waiting for her like he'd been expecting this visit. She didn't smile, didn't make small talk, just pulled out a large manila envelope from her briefcase and handed it directly to Blake. Pete paused, and I could tell he was trying to remember every detail accurately, knowing how important this might be. "George, I swear I've never seen a man's face change color so fast in my entire life." Blake was standing there in his doorway, normal color 1 second, and then he opens that envelope and starts reading whatever was inside. Within maybe 5 seconds, maybe less, he went from normal to white as a sheet. I mean, completely pale, like all the blood had just drained right out of his face and pooled in his feet. "What was in the envelope?" I asked, though I knew Pete couldn't have seen. Couldn't tell from where I was, but I could see his reaction clear as day. His hands started shaking so badly he could barely hold the papers. Then he started yelling at the woman loud enough that I could hear some of it from where I was working. He was saying things like, "This can't be right, and there must be some error in the documentation, and someone needs to recheck everything." "What did the woman say?" Pete shook his head. She just stood there, calm as could be, professional, like she'd delivered bad news 100 times before and was used to people's reactions. I saw her point to something in the documents, like she was showing him proof of whatever was being discussed. Then she said something, couldn't hear exactly what, but her body language was clear. She was basically telling him that whatever was in those papers was final, verified, no mistakes, no room for argument. Then she got back in her fancy car and drove away. And what did Blake do? "That's where it gets even more interesting," Pete said. "After the woman left, Blake went back inside the house for maybe 10 minutes. I could see him through the window, pacing back and forth, looking at those papers, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to figure something out. Then he came rushing back out with his jacket and his car keys, looking completely frantic, like a man whose house was on fire. He got in his car and just sat there in the driveway for a minute, staring at those papers spread out on his steering wheel. Then he started making phone calls. By that point, I'd moved to the front of the Pattersons' house to work on their porch railing, so I was closer and could hear more of what he was saying. What was he saying, I asked, feeling like I was on the edge of understanding something huge but couldn't quite see the full picture yet. Pete's expression grew more troubled. George, he was nearly shouting into his phone loud enough that I could catch quite a few words and phrases. He kept saying things like, "I need to find him immediately, and this changes everything, and I made a huge mistake and time is running out." His voice had this desperate edge to it, like he was begging whoever was on the other end of the line to help him with something urgent. And then Pete continued, "And this is the part that made me think I should find you and tell you right away. At one point I clearly heard him say your name. He was telling someone on the phone that he needed to locate George Carter as soon as possible, that it was urgent, that it was literally a matter of life and death." Those were his exact words, George. Life and death. My mouth went dry. Blake was looking for me. The same man who had thrown me out with racial slurs just 4 weeks ago, who had told me I was worthless and useless, who had slammed the door in my face, was now desperately trying to find me. "That's not all," Pete said. Over the next few hours, more people showed up at the house. Men in expensive suits carrying briefcases and clipboards who looked like lawyers or accountants. Someone who appeared to be another private investigator based on the way he was dressed and the camera he was carrying. They were all going in and out of the house, and every time I saw Blake, he looked more panicked than before. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. He couldn't seem to stand still. By the time I finished my work around 4 o'clock and was packing up to leave, Pete continued. Blake was back on his porch making more phone calls, and I heard him asking someone a very specific question. He was asking about where the homeless shelters were located in Atlanta, specifically which ones served elderly men. "He's looking for me at homeless shelters," I said, more to myself than to Pete. "Seems that way," Pete confirmed. "And, George, I've got to tell you, I've known Blake for the few years he was married to Janelle, seen him at neighborhood gatherings and such, and I've never seen him look like this. He looked like a man who just realized he'd made the worst mistake of his life and was running out of time to fix it. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever those investigators found, it's tearing him apart." After Pete left, I sat on the church steps for a long time trying to piece together the fragments of information I'd gathered. Blake had gone to a law firm asking about biological parentage and family connections. He'd received some kind of document from private investigators that had shocked him to his core. Now he was desperately trying to find me, telling people it was life or death urgent, asking about homeless shelters where elderly men might be staying. None of it made complete sense yet, but the pieces were starting to form a picture, even if I couldn't quite see what that picture was. That afternoon, I walked to the Auburn Avenue Public Library, a beautiful old building that had served Atlanta's black community for generations. I asked the librarian for help using the computers, explaining that I wasn't very familiar with the internet. She was patient and kind, showing me how to search for information. I typed in heritage investigations, slowly using 2 fingers, my reading glasses perched on my nose. Their website loaded professional and understated. The homepage explained that they specialized in genealogical research, family history verification, and biological parentage confirmation. They offered services like DNA analysis, historical records, research, birth certificate verification, and locating lost family members who'd been separated by time or circumstance. Their tagline, displayed prominently at the top of the page, read, "Uncovering the truth about who you really are." I stared at those words for a long time, feeling something shift in my understanding. Why would Blake hire a company like this? What truth was he trying to uncover, and why would any of it matter now that Janelle was gone? Then a thought struck me with such force that I actually gasped aloud, causing several people at nearby computers to look over at me with annoyed expressions. I apologized quietly and turned back to the screen, my mind racing. What if the investigation wasn't about whether I was Janelle's father? That had never been in question. I'd been there at her birth at Grady Memorial Hospital in 1977. I'd raised her from infancy, especially after her mother Clara died when Janelle was just 7 years old. I had her birth certificate, her school records, decades of photographs documenting our lives together, her report cards, everything that proved our relationship. But what if the investigation was about something else entirely? What if it wasn't about whether Janelle was my daughter? What if it was about who I was, about my own parentage, my own family history, my own identity? I sat back in the library chair, my hands trembling slightly as this new possibility opened up before me. What if it was about who I am? Memories started flooding back. Things I hadn't thought about in years, details that had seemed unimportant but now took on new significance. My mother had always been secretive about my father. Growing up, whenever I'd asked about him, she'd get this look on her face, this mixture of pain and fear, and she'd change the subject quickly. "He died when you were 2 years old," she'd always say in a voice that didn't invite further questions. "That's all you need to know, George. He's gone, and talking about him won't bring him back." But now, sitting in that library with the computer screen glowing in front of me, I realized there had never been pictures of him in our house. She'd never taken me to visit his grave. She'd never told me stories about what he was like, or how they'd met, or what kind of man he'd been. For someone who'd supposedly been married to him and had a child with him, she'd erased him completely from our lives. We'd moved from South Carolina to Atlanta when I was 3 years old. I had vague memories of that move, of my mother packing everything we owned into a single car, of driving for hours, of her constantly looking in the rearview mirror like she was afraid someone was following us. We'd never gone back to South Carolina after that, not once in all the years that followed. Whenever I'd asked about it as a child, asking if we could visit where I was born or see relatives back there, my mother would get that same frightened look and say no. "There's nothing back there for us anymore, George. Atlanta is our home now." When I was 5, my mother had remarried to a man named James Matthews. We'd taken his last name for a while, and I'd been George Matthews through elementary school. But when I turned 18, I'd legally changed my name back to George Carter, wanting to honor the father I'd never known, wanting to carry his name even though I couldn't remember his face. My mother had died 15 years ago when I was 61 and she was 83. When I'd gone through her belongings after the funeral, I'd found almost nothing from before our move to Atlanta. No photos from my first years of life. No documents about my father, no letters, no mementos, nothing that would tell me about where I came from or who my father had been. At the time, I'd assumed it was just too painful for her, that she'd destroyed everything that reminded her of a husband she'd lost too young. But now, sitting in this library, a new possibility was forming in my mind. I turned back to the computer and searched for my father's name, the name I'd carried all my life without really knowing the man behind it. Willie Carter, South Carolina, died 1950. The search results were sparse and contradictory. There was a Willie Carter who died in North Carolina in 1952, another Willie Carter who died in Georgia in 1948. But nothing that matched what my mother had told me, no death certificate in South Carolina records for a Willie Carter in 1950, no obituary, no grave site listed in any cemetery database I could find. It was like he'd never existed, or like someone had very carefully erased all traces of him from the public record. A new question formed in my mind, terrifying in its implications. What if my father hadn't died? What if my mother had lied to me about that? But why would she lie? Why would she tell a child that his father was dead if he wasn't? Unless she was running from something, or someone. Understanding started to dawn piece by piece. Blake had hired investigators hoping to find assets he could access through Janelle's estate, desperate to pay his gambling debts. But instead of finding hidden money or property, the investigators had discovered something completely unexpected. Something about my identity, my parentage, my family history. Something significant enough to send Blake into a complete panic. Significant enough to make him desperately try to undo what he'd done by throwing me out. That evening, back at Riverside Shelter, I lay on my cot with my mind racing through possibilities. Gerald was coughing next to me, that same wet, rattling cough he'd had for weeks. Across the room, the anonymous person was crying quietly into their pillow. But for once, those sounds faded into the background as my thoughts spiraled through decades of questions I'd never thought to ask. If my father hadn't died when I was 2, where had he gone? Why had my mother told me he was dead? Why had we moved away from South Carolina and never returned? Why had she destroyed or hidden every trace of my first years of life? And most importantly, why would any of this matter to Blake now, 4 weeks after he'd thrown me out? What could investigators have possibly discovered that would make him desperate to find me, desperate enough to search homeless shelters, desperate enough to call it a matter of life and death? For the first time since that terrible night when Blake had thrown me out, I felt something other than despair and hopelessness. I felt curiosity. I felt the stirring of something that might have been hope, though I didn't yet understand why. Something was happening. Something big enough to panic Blake. Something that involved my identity and my family and secrets that had been buried for decades. Blake was looking for me, but I wasn't ready to be found. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening. Not until I had some power in whatever situation was unfolding. I'd been powerless when he threw me out, when he called me that word, when he slammed the door in my face. I wouldn't be powerless again. What I didn't know that night, what I couldn't have possibly imagined as I lay there listening to the sounds of the shelter, was that the envelope Blake had received contained information that would change both our lives forever. That Blake's desperate search would reveal secrets that had been buried for more than 70 years. That the powerless homeless man he'd thrown away was actually connected to something far bigger than either of us had imagined. But that night, lying on my cot with questions swirling through my mind, I only knew that Blake was looking for me, that he was panicked about something, that whatever he'd discovered had made him realize he'd made a terrible mistake, and I knew that I wasn't ready to be found, not yet, not until I understood what was happening, not until I had power in whatever was unfolding. The next day would bring another piece of the puzzle, a phone call that would start to explain everything, a meeting that would reveal truths about my life that I'd never imagined. Secrets buried for decades were about to surface, and nothing would ever be the same again. It was Friday morning, 5 days after my conversation with Ruth and Pete about Blake's mysterious panic, when everything changed. I was helping Pastor Williams organize the food pantry, stacking cans of vegetables and boxes of pasta on the metal shelves, when Ruth appeared in the doorway with the parish phone in her hand. Her expression was serious, urgent, and I knew immediately that whatever this call was about, it was important. "George, there's a call for you," she said, holding out the phone. "It's a woman who says she's a lawyer and that it's very important. She's been trying to locate you for several days." My hands trembled as I took the phone from Ruth, my heart already racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Who would have a lawyer calling me at a church? "This is George Carter. Mr. Carter, good morning." "My name is Amanda Sterling from Morrison & Associates," the voice on the other end said. Professional, warm, but with an underlying urgency that made my stomach tighten. "I apologize for tracking you down this way, but we've been trying to locate you for several days now. We have some very important information regarding your family situation that I believe you need to hear as soon as possible." The formality in her voice made my pulse quicken. "I don't understand. Why would a law firm be looking for me? I'm just a retired teacher. I don't have any legal matters pending. Mr. Carter, I believe." "You know that Blake Morrison came to see us recently," Amanda said carefully. "What you don't know is why he came to us, and frankly, I think you have a right to understand what's happening. There are some things about your family history that have come to light, things that I believe you're completely unaware of. This really isn't something we should discuss over the phone. Would it be possible for you to come to our offices today, say 2 o'clock this afternoon?" I looked down at my worn clothes, my secondhand shoes with holes in the soles, my hands that were calloused from sweeping church steps. "I'm not exactly dressed for a downtown law office," I said quietly, feeling a flush of shame. "That doesn't matter, Mr. Carter," Amanda said firmly. "What matters is that you understand your situation before Blake finds you. And trust me when I tell you, he is looking for you very desperately. 2 o'clock, 42nd floor. I'll have someone waiting for you at the reception desk. This is important, Mr. Carter, possibly the most important meeting of your life." 3 hours later, I walked into the gleaming tower that housed Morrison & Associates, feeling completely out of place. The lobby was all polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of place where people wore $1,000 suits and carried expensive briefcases. I was wearing my best shirt from the thrift store and pants that were clean but showed their age. The security guard looked at me with suspicion until I mentioned Amanda Sterling's name, and then his expression changed to something resembling respect as he directed me to the express elevator. The 42nd floor was even more impressive than the lobby. Rich carpet, original artwork on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Atlanta that seemed to stretch forever. The receptionist smiled warmly when I gave my name and immediately picked up her phone. Amanda Sterling met me at the elevator within seconds. She was a black woman in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit with kind eyes that softened when she saw me. "Mr. Carter." "Thank you so much for coming," she said, extending her hand. "I know this must seem strange, but I promise everything will make sense very soon. Please follow me." She led me down a hallway lined with conference rooms, each one larger and more impressive than the last, until we reached a corner office with views that took my breath away. Inside, another person was waiting, a distinguished-looking black man in his early 60s with silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "Mr. Carter, this is James Franklin," Amanda said as we entered. "He's our senior partner and specializes in estate law. What we're about to tell you involves his area of expertise, and frankly, it's one of the most extraordinary cases either of us has ever handled." We all sat down around a large conference table and Amanda slid a thick manila folder across to me. The folder had to be at least 3 inches thick, bulging with documents and photographs. Mr. Carter, before we begin, I want you to know that everything we're about to tell you has been thoroughly verified. Amanda said, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart race. We've spent the past 3 weeks checking and rechecking every detail, consulting with multiple experts because frankly what we discovered is so extraordinary that we needed to be absolutely certain before we brought you in. James Franklin leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. Mr. Carter, let me start by explaining how we came to be involved in your situation. About a month ago, Blake Morrison contacted our firm. He was in serious financial trouble and was looking for any possible way to access funds that might help him out of a very dangerous situation. How much trouble? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James pulled out a document from the folder. He owes approximately $850,000 in gambling debts to some very dangerous people. These aren't bank loans or credit cards, Mr. Carter. These are debts to individuals who don't take kindly to non-payment, and who have made it very clear what will happen if Blake doesn't come up with the money quickly. We're talking about serious, potentially life-threatening consequences. So he came to you looking for what money he thought he could access through Janelle's estate. Exactly, Amanda said. He hired a private investigation firm called Heritage Investigations to research your family background very thoroughly. He was hoping to find some hidden wealth, some property, some trust fund, anything that he might be able to claim or access through his deceased wife's connection to you. He was desperate, searching for any lifeline that could save him from his creditors. And what did he find? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer was going to change everything. Amanda and James exchanged a look, and then Amanda opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It was a birth certificate, but as I looked more closely, I noticed there were correction marks on it, places where information had been altered or amended over the years. Mr. Carter, James said gently, his voice carrying the weight of what he was about to reveal. Are you familiar with the name George Washington Carter Sr.? The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something I'd heard in passing but couldn't quite place. I don't think so. Should I be? He was your father, Amanda said quietly. My father's name was Willie Carter, I said, automatically repeating what I'd been told my entire life. He died when I was 2 years old in South Carolina. That's what my mother always told me. James shook his head slowly. Mr. Carter, your father's name was George Washington Carter Sr. He didn't die when you were 2 years old. In fact, he lived until 2005 and spent nearly 40 years of his life searching for you, trying to find the son who'd been taken from him. The room began to spin. I gripped the edge of the conference table to steady myself. That's impossible. My mother would have told me. Why would she lie about something like that? Because she was running, Amanda said quietly. In 1950, your parents went through a divorce. It was not a friendly divorce, Mr. Carter. It was bitter and filled with fear. Your mother was terrified, and she made the decision to take you and disappear completely. She changed your name from George Washington Carter Jr. to George Willie Carter using her maiden name. She moved you from South Carolina to Atlanta and told you that your father was dead to prevent any attempts at contact or reconciliation. But why, I asked, my voice breaking. Why would she do that? Why would she take me away from my father and lie about it for my entire life? We may never know her full reasons, James said, but what we do know is that your father never stopped looking for you. He hired private investigators year after year. He filed missing persons reports. He kept a trust fund open and waiting for you from the day you turned 21, hoping that somehow someday you would be found and could claim what was rightfully yours. Amanda pulled out another document, and this one made my breath catch in my throat. It was a corporate filing from 1948, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. The company name at the top read Carter Manufacturing and Holdings Incorporated. Mr. Carter, your father didn't die poor and unknown, Amanda said, watching my face carefully. He was George Washington Carter Sr., founder and CEO of what became one of the most successful black-owned industrial manufacturing companies in American history. I stared at the document, unable to process what I was hearing. My father owned a company. Not just any company, James said, and then he began pulling out photographs, spreading them across the table in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed. The first photograph was black and white, dated 1948 on the back. It showed a young black man couldn't have been more than 28 years old standing in front of a small wooden building. The sign above him read, "Carter Machine Works." He wore work clothes that were covered in grease and oil, but his expression carried a pride and determination that seemed to radiate from the faded photograph. "This is your father," Amanda said softly. This was his first machine shop in Charleston, South Carolina. He started with just 3 tools that he'd bought secondhand with money he'd saved from his military service during World War II. A lathe drill press and a welding torch. That's all he had, Mr. Carter. He worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, taking any job that would pay, slowly building something from nothing. She showed me another photograph dated 1949. The same building, but it had been expanded. New equipment was visible through the open doors. And standing beside my father were 3 other black men in work clothes, all of them smiling at the camera. By the second year, he'd hired his first employees, James explained. All of them were returning veterans like him, black men who couldn't find work anywhere else because white-owned businesses wouldn't hire black men for skilled positions. Your father gave them not just jobs, Mr. Carter, but dignity. Fair wages, safe working conditions, respect. He treated them like the skilled craftsmen they were. Then Amanda pulled out a newspaper clipping so fragile it was encased in protective plastic. The headline from the Charleston Gazette dated March 1950 read, "Negro Business Owner Wins Major Contract." This article detailed how your father's machine shop had secured a major contract with a textile mill to manufacture replacement parts for their equipment, James said. It was a breakthrough that would have meant real financial security for his growing business. Your father was 29 years old and on the verge of something significant. What happened, I asked, though part of me could already guess. James's expression grew somber. The contract was canceled 3 days after this article ran. The mill's owner received intense pressure from other white business owners in Charleston who didn't want to see a black man succeed. They made it very clear that if he continued to do business with your father, they would boycott his mill. Your father lost everything he'd worked so hard to build. And that's when the threats started getting really serious, Amanda added quietly. That's when the Klan burned down his workshop one night. Burned it to the ground with all his equipment, all his tools, everything. That's when your mother made her decision. She was terrified for you, for herself. The violence against successful black people in the South in 1950 was intense and real. She probably thought she was protecting you by disappearing, by erasing any connection to your father. But my father didn't give up, I said, looking at the next photograph Amanda had placed in front of me. This one showed a larger building brick instead of wood, with a professional sign reading Carter Manufacturing. The year stamped on the back was 1952. He rebuilt in a different state, James explained. He moved the entire operation to North Carolina, where he had some military connections, people who would give him a chance. He started over completely from scratch, but this time he was smarter about it. He didn't advertise his race. He used white intermediaries for contracts and negotiations. He built his reputation through quality and reliability rather than visibility. Amanda spread out financial records from the 1950s and 1960s. Your father was brilliant not just at manufacturing but at business strategy. He saw opportunities that others missed. When the aerospace industry started taking off in the early 1960s, he positioned his company to manufacture precision parts for aircraft. When the automotive industry was expanding, he quickly adapted his processes to meet their exacting standards. By 1965, James continued pulling out more documents. Carter Manufacturing had 3 separate facilities, employed over 200 people, and had contracts with some of the biggest corporations in America: General Motors, Boeing, Lockheed. And here's the remarkable thing, Mr. Carter. Almost nobody in the corporate world knew the owner was a black man. Your father had learned to hide in plain sight to succeed despite a system that was designed to keep him down rather than waiting for that system to change and give him permission. But he never stopped searching for you, Amanda said, and now she pulled out a thick stack of private investigator reports. These span from 1951 all the way to 2004, just 3 months before your father died. Dozens and dozens of reports. Some are just a few pages, dead ends, and false leads that went nowhere. Others are extensive files documenting searches that covered multiple states and consumed months of work. Your father spent hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years trying to find you, but your mother had hidden your trail too well. The last report is dated November 2004, James said, showing me the document. Your father was 84 years old at this point, dying of cancer, and he was still paying investigators to search for you. His final words to the Board of Trustees were recorded in the meeting minutes from December 2004. He told them, "Continue the search for my son. No matter how long it takes. He is out there somewhere, and he deserves to know who he is. He deserves his inheritance. He deserves the truth." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't even try to stop them. Amanda quietly pushed a box of tissues across the table. "There's one more thing," she said softly, pulling out a small velvet box. "Your father had this made in 1948, and he wore it every single day of his life for 57 years. The Board of Trustees has kept it safe all these years, waiting for this moment." I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a simple gold ring worn smooth from decades of wear. I turned it over and saw an inscription engraved on the inside. "For my son, George Jr., with love, always Dad." "It was on his finger when he died," James said quietly. I slipped the ring onto my own finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to finally claim it. In that moment, I felt a connection to a father I'd never known, a man who'd loved me enough to search for me for 40 years to build an empire with the hope that someday his son would come home. "Mr. Carter," James continued after giving me a moment to compose myself, "in 1968, when you turned 21, your father established a formal trust in your name. The instructions were very explicit. If George Washington Carter Jr. was ever found, and his identity confirmed, the trust and controlling interest in the company would immediately transfer to him. Your father put everything in place and then waited, hoping you'd be found in his lifetime. The company didn't just survive after your father died," Amanda said. "It thrived. Carter Manufacturing expanded into more areas: automotive parts, aerospace components, military contracts. When your father passed away in 2005, the company was valued at approximately $2.8 billion. A board of trustees has been managing it carefully all these years, waiting for you to be found." James pulled out current financial statements. "Today, nearly 20 years later, Carter Manufacturing and Holdings is valued at approximately $3.2 billion. And the trust fund that your father established for you in 1968 has been accumulating interest for 57 years. Current value of that trust is approximately $600 million. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. "You're telling me that I'm worth almost $4 billion, $3.8 billion to be precise," James confirmed. "You are one of the wealthiest black men in America. Mr. Carter, you just didn't know it because your mother's decision to hide you and change your name meant that all these years you've been living as George Willie Carter, while your true identity as George Washington Carter Jr. was being searched for by a company with virtually unlimited resources." "But they never found me," I whispered. "Not until Blake Morrison hired Heritage Investigations to look into your family background," Amanda said, and now her voice carried a note of irony. "The investigators were very thorough. They found the records of your name change. They traced your mother's trail from South Carolina to Georgia. They discovered that George Willie Carter, retired teacher, living modestly on a pension, was actually George Washington Carter Jr., heir to a massive fortune. And that's what was in the envelope that Pete saw being delivered to Blake. Blake found out who I really am," I said slowly, understanding washing over me in waves. "And that's when he panicked." "Exactly," James confirmed. "And that's when he came to us in a state of complete panic, because Blake Morrison had just realized that he'd thrown out his billionaire father-in-law, the man who could have saved him from his gambling debts with pocket change. And he'd done it in the most cruel and racist way possible, which brings us to the most important part of this entire situation." Amanda pulled out yet another document from the seemingly endless folder. "Mr. Carter, your father was very aware of how wealth could make someone vulnerable to exploitation, especially in a country where black people had to fight for every scrap of respect and dignity. His will contains a very specific clause that was designed to protect you and your descendants." She read from the document, her voice clear and firm. "Any person who mistreats, abuses, or shows disrespect to George Washington Carter Jr. or his descendants shall be permanently barred from any financial benefit from the Carter estate, either directly or through marriage or family connection. This clause is irrevocable and cannot be challenged or overturned under any circumstances." James looked at me seriously. "Mr. Carter Blake's treatment of you, the racist language he used, the abuse, the way he threw you out onto the street on the day of your daughter's funeral, All of that clearly and unambiguously qualifies as mistreatment and abuse under the terms of your father's will. So Blake can't access any of the money, I said, pieces clicking into place. Not a single cent, Amanda confirmed. Even though he was married to your daughter, Janelle, even though he might have been able to argue that he had some claim through that family connection, the moment he abused you with racist language and threw you out, he triggered the clause in your father's will. It's permanent and absolute. There is no appeal, no exception, no loophole. Blake Morrison is barred forever from benefiting from the Carter estate. The truly ironic part, James added with a grim smile, is that by hiring the investigators in the first place, by trying to find hidden assets he could exploit, Blake is the one who uncovered the truth about who you are. He literally created his own downfall through his own greed and desperation. That's why he's desperately searching for me, I said, understanding flooding through me. He realized what he'd done. He knows he threw away his only chance at salvation. He came back to our office 3 days ago, Amanda said. He was begging us to find some legal way around the clause in the will, asking if we could help him prove that his treatment of you wasn't really abuse, that it was just a misunderstanding born of grief. He's been calling us multiple times every day since then. He knows he's running out of time with his creditors, and he knows that the one person in the world who could save him with a simple phone call is the man he called the N-word and threw out like garbage. How many people know about this? I asked, my mind spinning with the implications. Very few right now, James said. The board of trustees at Carter Manufacturing knows they've been preparing for this moment for decades. The investigators know, obviously. Blake knows, which is why he's panicking. And now you know. What happens next, whether this becomes public knowledge or stays private, whether the media finds out or the community learns about it, all of that is entirely up to you, Mr. Carter. There's one final thing you need to see, Amanda said, gently pulling out one last envelope from the folder. Your father wrote this letter in 2004, a year before he died. He updated it annually after that, always hoping it would reach you. The Board of Trustees kept it sealed, waiting for this day. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting. To my son, George Washington Carter, Jr., on the day he is finally found. My hands shook as I opened it carefully and began to read my father's words. My dearest son, if you are reading this, it means you have finally been found, that the search that consumed the last decades of my life has finally succeeded. I don't know how old you are now, whether I'm alive to see this moment or long gone. But I need you to know certain truths that have weighed on my heart every day since your mother took you from me. Your mother and I loved each other once deeply and truly. But that love turned bitter and toxic in ways I still don't fully understand. When she took you away in 1950, I was devastated beyond words. I hired investigators. I filed missing persons reports with every police department in the South. I searched every way I knew how, but she had hidden you. Well, changed your name, erased every connection between us. I built Carter Manufacturing not for wealth or prestige, but because I needed purpose after losing you. Every patent I filed, every contract I won, every success I achieved was driven by the hope that if I built something significant enough, somehow you would hear about it, somehow you would find your way back to me. I never remarried, never had other children. You were my only son, and no amount of time or distance could change that. I established a trust for you, placed my company in the hands of trustees who promised to search for you and transfer everything to you when you were found. Everything I built is yours, not because of obligation or duty, but because you are my legacy, my hope, my son. I don't know what kind of man you've become. I don't know if you'll forgive me for not finding you sooner, for not searching harder, for not being there to watch you grow up. But I want you to know that not a day passed when I didn't think of you, when I didn't wonder where you were, when I didn't pray for your safety and happiness. Use this fortune wisely, son. Build something good with it. Help others the way I tried to help returning veterans who couldn't find work. Honor our family name with dignity and purpose. And know that wherever I am, whether watching from heaven or long turned to dust, I am proud of you, and I love you with all my heart. Your father always, George Washington Carter, Sr. I couldn't see the words anymore through my tears. Amanda handed me more tissues, and James gave me time to compose myself. Your father was a good man, Mr. Carter, James said softly after a long silence. He built an empire while fighting racism at every turn. He proved that black excellence could thrive even in a system designed to prevent exactly that. And he never ever gave up hope of finding his son. And now Amanda added her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Blake Morrison, a white man who thought he could abuse an elderly black man without consequences, who used racist slurs and cruelty, is about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. What happens to Blake? I asked quietly. That's not our concern, James said with a shrug. His creditors will do what creditors do when they're not paid. He'll likely have to declare bankruptcy, lose everything he owns. But that's the consequence of his choices, his gambling addiction, his cruelty, his racism. Not our problem to solve. And what happens to me, James smiled, that Mr. Carter is entirely up to you. You're about to become one of the most powerful black men in America. How you use that power, that wealth, that platform, that's your decision to make. But first, we need to legally establish your identity, protect you from people who will inevitably try to exploit you and decide what you want to do about Blake. I looked down at my father's letter, at the documents proving who I really was, at the lawyers who had tracked me down to tell me that my entire life had been based on a lie my mother had told. I thought about Blake, who had thrown me out thinking I was nothing, who had used the most hateful word in the English language, who had erased my daughter's memory and brought another woman into her home within weeks. And now Blake was desperately searching for me, knowing that I was his only hope, not knowing that his own racist actions had destroyed that hope forever. When does Blake find out that I know? I asked. When does he learn that he destroyed himself? James smiled grimly. That Mr. Carter is entirely up to you. We can arrange a meeting whenever you're ready, or we can let him keep searching, keep panicking, keep destroying himself with worry and fear. The choice is yours. I thought about my father, who had searched for me for 40 years out of love, not desperation. I thought about Janelle, who would have been so proud to know our true family history. I thought about Ruth and Pastor Williams and the volunteers at First Baptist who had shown me kindness when I had nothing. And I thought about Blake, who had shown his true racist face the moment he thought I was powerless. Let him search a while longer, I said quietly. Let him understand what it feels like to be desperate and powerless. Let him realize what he's lost. And then when he's at his lowest point, when he thinks there might still be hope, that's when I'll let him find me. But not the homeless man he threw away. The billionaire he created through his own stupidity and cruelty. Justice, I was learning, could be very sweet indeed. The transformation happened within 48 hours of that meeting with James Franklin and Amanda Sterling. One day, I was sleeping on a metal cot at Riverside Shelter, listening to Gerald cough and Anonymous crying, wondering if I'd survive another week on the streets. The next day, I was in a suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Buckhead, surrounded by lawyers and financial advisors who were helping me understand the empire I had inherited, the father I'd never known, and the power I now possessed. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself to Blake yet. Not even close. I wanted to watch him search. I wanted to see him desperate. I wanted him to understand, truly understand what it felt like to be powerless and afraid to have your entire future hanging by a thread that someone else controlled. Amanda had assigned a paralegal from her firm to monitor Blake's activities and report back to me regularly. Over the next 2 weeks, I received detailed updates that were both deeply satisfying and profoundly disturbing in equal measure. Blake was unraveling, coming apart at the seams, and every report made it clearer that his desperation was consuming him from the inside out. 3 days after my meeting with the lawyers, Ruth found me at the church. I was still working there, still sweeping the steps and helping with the food program, not ready to leave the community that had shown me kindness when I had nothing. Ruth's face was troubled as she approached. George Blake came to First Baptist yesterday afternoon, she said, keeping her voice low even though we were alone. He was offering $50 to anyone who could tell him where you were staying. He went around asking everyone, showing them a photo of you on his phone, getting more frantic with each person who said they hadn't seen you. What did Pastor Williams do? Ruth smiled grimly. Pastor refused to speak with him at first, just kept doing his work. But Blake became aggressive, started raising his voice right there in the church. He was saying it was a life or death emergency, that you were in danger on the streets, that we were being irresponsible by not helping him find you. Pastor finally had enough and asked him to leave. How did Blake look? I asked, curious despite myself. Ruth's expression grew more concerned. Terrible, George. Like he hasn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, he needed a shave, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone steady. I've seen desperate people before, but this was different. This was a man on the edge of complete collapse. 2 days later, Pete Johnson brought me another report. Blake had actually hired Pete to help canvass the neighborhood, not knowing that Pete had no intention of actually helping him find me. "George, it's like watching a man destroy himself in real time," Pete said, shaking his head. "Blake's going door to door all through Cascade Heights, showing your photo, offering money to anyone who'll tell him where you are. But here's the thing, nobody's helping him. Not a single person." "Why not?" I asked. Though I thought I already knew the answer. Pete grinned. "Mrs. Patterson might have closed her curtains that night, but she told everyone in the neighborhood exactly what she heard. The Johnsons next door, the Washingtons across the street, everyone knows what Blake did. They know he used racist language, that he threw out an elderly black man on the day of his daughter's funeral. The whole black community is stonewalling him, and it's beautiful to watch." He paused, then continued. "Mrs. Patterson told Blake straight to his face that she'd never seen you. The Johnsons claimed they didn't even know Janelle had a father. Person after person, door after door, everyone's protecting you from him. The whole community is working against him, George. And honestly, it's one of the most beautiful examples of black solidarity I've ever seen." I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. This is what community meant, what black solidarity looked like. People who barely knew me were protecting me from a racist white man simply because it was the right thing to do. Amanda's investigator brought even more detailed reports. Blake had expanded his search to every homeless shelter in Atlanta, visiting them at different times of day, showing my photo to staff and residents, growing more desperate with each dead end. He'd hired his own private investigator to try to track me down. He'd even contacted some of my former teaching colleagues, claiming there was an emergency, and he needed to find me urgently. A week after the initial revelation, James Franklin called me with news that made my blood run cold, even as it confirmed how desperate Blake had become. "Mr. Carter Blake has filed paperwork with the court claiming that you may be suffering from dementia or diminished mental capacity," James said, his voice grave. "He's trying to get himself appointed as your legal guardian." Guardian. The word felt like poison in my mouth. "It's a desperate move," James explained. "If he could somehow convince a judge that you're incapable of managing your own affairs, he could potentially gain control over your assets as your court-appointed guardian. Of course it won't work. We have cognitive assessments from your recent meetings proving you're completely competent. But it shows how far he's willing to go, Mr. Carter. He's literally trying to steal your inheritance by claiming you're senile. So he's rewriting history," I said bitterly, "making himself the concerned son-in-law instead of the abusive racist he actually is." "Exactly," James confirmed. "But it won't work. We've already filed counter motions with the court, including documentation of his abuse and the will clause that permanently bars him from any benefit from your estate." 3 days later, Pastor Williams called with another disturbing report. Brother George Blake showed up at our Wednesday night Bible study. The pastor said, anger evident in his normally calm voice. He actually interrupted the service, demanding to know where you were. He was saying you were mentally ill and needed help, that the church was being irresponsible by not telling him your location. I had the deacons remove him. How did he react? Pastor Williams sighed. Like a cornered animal. He started shouting about how he had powerful lawyers, how the church would regret not helping him, how we'd be held responsible if anything happened to you. The deacons had to physically escort him out. Brother George, that man is coming apart at the seams. The paralegals' reports confirmed this deterioration. Blake had stopped going to work entirely. His car was spotted at various locations around Atlanta at all hours of the day and night, suggesting he wasn't sleeping. He'd been seen at the Greyhound bus station, apparently thinking I might be trying to leave the city. He'd checked emergency rooms, thinking I might be hospitalized. He was searching with the manic energy of a desperate man who knew his time was running out. 8 days into the second week, Blake made a move that showed just how far he'd fallen. He created a fake social media account pretending to be a homeless services outreach worker. He posted in local Facebook groups claiming he was looking for an elderly black man named George Carter who needed assistance with accessing benefits. He shared my photo and wrote a whole story about wanting to help. The post was reported within hours. Multiple people in the Cascade Heights community recognized it as Blake's work and called him out publicly. The comments section turned into a referendum on Blake's behavior, with dozens of people sharing what they knew. "Your son-in-law threw this man out on the day of his daughter's funeral," one comment read. "Used the N-word, left him homeless. Now he's pretending to care. This is manipulation, not help." The post was taken down by Facebook moderators, but not before screenshots had spread throughout Atlanta's black community. Blake's reputation was being destroyed in real time, his racism and cruelty documented and shared widely, his lies exposed for everyone to see. On day 10 of his search, Blake tried the legal guardian angle again, this time filing an emergency petition claiming I was a danger to myself, that I was living on the streets due to mental incapacity. James Franklin filed counter motions immediately, including extensive documentation of Blake's abuse and the will clause that barred him permanently. The judge would see through Blake's manipulation easily, but it showed his level of desperation. The next day brought news that Blake had hired a second private investigator, this one specializing in locating homeless individuals who'd moved between cities. Amanda obtained the investigator's report through legal channels, and it made for disturbing reading. Subject Morrison is exhibiting signs of extreme stress and possible mental breakdown, the investigator had written. He calls at all hours, sometimes coherent and focused, sometimes rambling and incoherent. He has mentioned suicide multiple times during our conversations. I strongly recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation. Blake was unraveling fast, Amanda said, showing me the report. He's driven to Savannah on a false lead someone gave him. Drove all the way to Birmingham on another wild goose chase. It's become a game in the neighborhood. People are taking his money and sending him to other cities, anywhere but where you actually are. He's wasting time and money he doesn't have. The credit card records that Blake's creditors had subpoenaed told an even more alarming story. In the 2 weeks since learning my true identity, Blake had spent over $40,000 on his search. Private investigators charging by the hour and by the mile. Gas for driving all over the Southeast chasing false leads. Cash payments to people for information that turned out to be worthless. Multiple lawyer consultations trying to find some way around the will clause. He was hemorrhaging money he didn't have, digging himself deeper into debt even as his original deadline approached. Even if you were willing to help him, which you've made clear you're not, Amanda observed, he now owes even more than when he started. He's making his situation worse with every desperate move. Desperation doesn't do math, I replied quietly. On day 12 of his search, Blake went to Ebenezer Baptist Church, the historic church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had preached. He stood up during the Sunday service and started shouting about needing to find me, claiming it was life or death, accusing the black community of conspiring against him. He actually used the phrase reverse racism. Ruth reported to me later, her voice filled with disgust, said that if you were white and he were black, everyone would be helping him. The deacons escorted him out, but not before he made a complete scene. George, even in his desperation, his racism keeps surfacing. He can't help himself. The next day brought Blake's lowest point yet. He was arrested for trespassing at Riverside Shelter after refusing to leave when staff told him I wasn't there and asked him to go. He spent 6 hours in jail before being released on his own recognizance. The mugshot that circulated online showed a man I barely recognized. Gaunt face with sunken, wild eyes. Expensive clothes that now hung loose on his frame from rapid weight loss. Hair unkempt and greasy. The look of a man who'd forgotten what sleep felt like. This was the same man who'd stood on his porch just 6 weeks ago, confident and cruel, watching me load my suitcases with contempt in his eyes. Now he looked like exactly what he was, a desperate man who'd gambled everything and lost it all. On day 14, Pete overheard another crucial piece of information. Blake was sitting in his car outside a shelter talking on his phone loud enough that Pete could hear from where he was working across the street. I understand the deadline, Blake was saying, his voice cracking with stress. These people don't accept excuses. I know that. Just give me 5 more days, please. Just 5 more days and I'll have the money. I'm doing everything I can to find him. Pete found me at the church later that day. George, whatever he owes, whoever he owes it to, he knows exactly what's coming if he doesn't pay. He's terrified. And he knows you're his only possible salvation. But what he doesn't know, I said quietly, is that his own actions made that salvation impossible. That evening, sitting in my suite at the Ritz-Carlton, I reviewed all the reports and photographs Amanda's paralegal had compiled. Blake had searched for me for 2 straight weeks. He'd offered money, made threats, filed false reports, tried legal manipulation, harassed churches and communities throughout Atlanta. He'd revealed himself to be not just racist, but desperate, manipulative, and willing to do absolutely anything to save himself from the consequences of his own choices. He had 5 days left before his deadline. 5 days of knowing that his salvation existed somewhere in this city, but remained frustratingly, impossibly out of reach. I thought about my father, George Washington Carter Sr., who had searched for me for 40 years. But his search had been driven by love, not desperation. He'd built an empire hoping to pass it on to his son, not to exploit him. He'd written a letter full of love and regret and hope, not manipulation and racist contempt. Blake's search was the opposite in every way. It was selfish and desperate and tainted by the same racism that had led him to throw me out in the first place. Even now, even knowing who I really was and how much I was worth, he couldn't help but use racial slurs when he thought no one who mattered was listening. I walked to the mirror and looked at the man staring back at me. He was different from the one who'd slept in a car in a Walmart parking lot 5 weeks ago. Better clothes, certainly. Better fed without question. But more than that, there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A knowledge of what cruelty looked like up close. An understanding of how quickly dignity could be stripped away and how precious and powerful it was to reclaim it. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I would let Blake find me, but not at a shelter or a soup kitchen. Not as the powerless old man he'd discarded like trash. Tomorrow Blake would walk into a conference room at Morrison & Associates expecting another dead end in his desperate search. Instead, he would find me sitting there in a $2,000 suit with lawyers flanking me on both sides with documents spread out before me showing exactly who I was and exactly what he'd lost through his own stupidity and hatred. Tomorrow, Blake would learn that the old black man he'd called the N-word was actually worth $3.8 billion, that the father-in-law he'd thrown away could have saved him from his gambling debts with what amounted to pocket change, that he was now legally and permanently barred from accessing any of it because of his own racist abuse. Tomorrow, Blake would understand that actions have consequences, that racism has a price, that cruelty can destroy not just the victim, but the perpetrator as well. For the first time since Janelle's death, I felt something close to peace as I prepared for bed that night. Not because I wanted revenge, though I'd be lying if I said the thought didn't provide some satisfaction, but because I was finally going to reclaim my dignity. Finally going to stand before the man who'd tried to strip it away and show him that he had failed completely. Blake had thought he'd destroyed me that night when he threw me out with his racial slurs and his contempt. Instead, through his own greed and cruelty and racism, he had destroyed himself. And tomorrow, he would learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. I slept well that night, deeply and peacefully, with my father's ring on my finger and the knowledge that justice delayed for decades, but finally arriving could indeed be sweet. Tomorrow, Blake Morrison would learn what it meant when a black man he'd called worthless turned out to hold his entire future in his hands. And that black man would say no. I chose Tuesday morning for the confrontation deliberately, exactly 6 weeks after Blake had thrown me out. The symmetry felt appropriate, almost poetic. 6 weeks ago, I'd been powerless, broken, sleeping in my car. Today, I would face him as one of the wealthiest black men in America. I arrived at Morrison & Associates at 9:30, giving myself time to settle in and review the strategy with James Franklin and Amanda Sterling. The custom-tailored charcoal suit that had been delivered to my hotel the previous day fit perfectly. $2,000 for the suit alone, $500 for the Italian leather shoes, $200 for the silk tie. The transformation was complete. I looked nothing like the broken man who'd slept on shelter cots just weeks before. James reviewed the plan one final time. Remember, Mr. Carter, you don't have to explain anything to him. You don't owe him any justification for your decisions. This meeting is purely so he understands the reality of his situation and the consequences of his actions. I understand, I said, adjusting my tie in the reflection of the conference room window. But I want him to hear it from me. I want him to know exactly what he threw away and exactly why he can never get it back. At 9:58, Amanda's phone buzzed. "He's in the lobby," she said quietly. "Coming up now." My heart rate increased, but my hands remained steady. This was the moment I'd been anticipating for 2 weeks. The moment when Blake would finally understand the magnitude of his mistake. We positioned ourselves strategically. James and Amanda sat at the conference table, legal pads and folders arranged before them. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, my back to the door, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The reveal would be dramatic, deliberate, designed for maximum impact. I heard the elevator chime, footsteps in the hallway, Amanda's assistant greeting Blake and directing him to the conference room. The door opened. "Mr. Morrison." "Thank you for coming in," James said formally. "Please have a seat." I kept my back turned, looking out at the city, giving Blake time to settle into his chair. I could hear his breathing rapid and shallow, could hear the nervous tapping of his fingers on the polished conference table. "Have you found him?" Blake's voice was hoarse, desperate, barely holding together. "Please tell me you've found George. I'm running out of time here. I only have 4 days left before—" He trailed off, unwilling to articulate the threat he was facing. "Mr. Morrison," Amanda said carefully, "we do have some information about George Carter's whereabouts. But before we discuss that, there's someone here who wants to speak with you." That was my cue. I turned slowly from the window, taking my time, letting Blake's eyes adjust to the figure silhouetted against the bright morning light streaming through the glass. "Hello, Blake." The recognition took exactly 3 seconds. First came confusion as his brain tried to process what his eyes were seeing. Then disbelief as he began to understand who was standing before him. Finally, shock that drained every bit of color from his already pale face. "George." His voice was barely a whisper. "George, is that you?" I walked to the conference table with measured, deliberate steps. I pulled out the chair directly across from Blake and sat down slowly, holding his gaze the entire time. The power dynamic was immediately unmistakably clear. I was composed, well-dressed, flanked by expensive lawyers. Blake was disheveled, desperate, completely alone. "It's me," I said calmly. "Though I look a bit different from the last time you saw me, don't I? Not quite the useless old man you threw into the street." Blake's mouth opened and closed several times before he found words. "George, thank God. I've been looking everywhere for you. I've been so worried. When you left that night, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I was grieving, not thinking straight. Losing Janelle affected me more than I realized, and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have said those things. I shouldn't have asked you to leave so abruptly." I leaned back in my chair, studying him like a specimen under glass. "Is that your version of what happened? That I left? That you asked me to leave?" "Abruptly?" Blake stammered, searching for words. "Well, I mean, I know I was harsh. I know I said some things in anger. But George, you have to understand the pressure I was under. The financial stress, the grief, everything was overwhelming. I wasn't myself that night." "You weren't yourself," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "So the Blake who called me the N-word, who told me to go live with welfare bums, who threw my suitcases into the street and slammed the door in my face, that wasn't the real you." Blake's eyes darted to the lawyers, then back to me. I don't remember saying those exact words. The whole evening is kind of a blur. I was emotionally compromised, George. Surely you can understand that. We both loved Janelle. We were both hurting. Mrs. Patterson heard every word through her window, I said calmly. The Johnsons next door captured audio from their security system. We have documentation, Blake. We have evidence of exactly what you said and exactly how you said it. His face went even paler if that was possible. "Look, whatever I said, I apologize. I was wrong. I should have been more supportive, more understanding. That's why I've been searching for you all these weeks. I want to make amends. I want to help you get back on your feet. You can come back to the house. I'll take care of everything. We can put this all behind us." "Why?" The single word stopped him cold. Stopped. "What do you mean, why? Why do you suddenly want to help me? Why have you been desperately searching for me for 2 weeks? Why are you offering to let me back into the house you threw me out of with such contempt?" Blake glanced at the lawyers again, clearly hoping they would intervene. They remained silent, watching the scene unfold. "Because your family, George. Because Janelle would have wanted us to stick together. Because I realize now that I made a mistake in how I handled things that night." "I see," I said quietly. "And this realization, this sudden desire to make amends, it wouldn't have anything to do with what you learned from Heritage Investigations, would it?" The blood drained from Blake's face completely. He understood now. Understood that I knew. That somehow I had learned what he'd discovered. "George, let me explain." "Let me guess," I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "You hired investigators to look into my family background, hoping to find some assets you could access to pay off your gambling debts. Instead, you found out something you never expected, something that sent you into a panic and made you desperately try to find the old black man you'd thrown away like garbage." Blake's hands were shaking now, gripping the edge of the table. "George, if you know what I found out, then you understand why I've been looking for you. This changes everything. We're family. We can help each other. You have resources now. I'm in trouble, deep trouble. We can work together, help each other. I repeated. Tell me, Blake, exactly how much trouble are you in? His voice dropped to almost a whisper. $850,000. And who do you owe it to? People who don't accept apologies or excuses. People who have made it very clear what will happen if I don't pay by Friday. George, I'm not exaggerating when I say these are dangerous individuals. So you're in real danger. Physical danger. Yes. And you think I'm going to save you? It wasn't a question, but Blake answered anyway. George, I know I messed up. I know I said terrible things, but we can move past that. $850,000 is nothing compared to what you're worth now. You could write a check right now and it wouldn't even make a dent in your accounts. You could save my life with what amounts to pocket change for you. I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the city where I'd taught history for 40 years, where I'd raised my daughter, where I'd been broken and rebuilt. Blake, do you know anything about how your father lost his family's fortune? The question clearly confused him. What, my father? I don't see what that has to do with. Gambling, I said, turning to face him. Your grandfather gambled away the entire family fortune in the 1970s. Your father spent his entire life trying to rebuild what was lost and never succeeded. And you, Blake, you followed right in your grandfather's footsteps. Gambling, addiction, destroying everything you touched. Blake's jaw clenched. That's not fair. I had some bad luck, made some poor investments. You have a gambling addiction, I said flatly. The investigator's report details your visits to casinos over the past 5 years. Hundreds of trips, millions of dollars lost. This isn't bad luck, Blake. This is a disease you refused to treat, a problem you hid from everyone, including my daughter. I can get help, Blake said desperately. I'll go to therapy, join Gamblers Anonymous, whatever you want. Just help me get out of this immediate situation, and I promise I'll change. Tell me how it started, I said, sitting back down. Tell me the truth about your gambling. Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. It started small. Just betting on football games with some guys I knew from college. I won, sometimes lost, sometimes. It was just fun, just entertainment. But then I started losing more than I was winning, and I thought if I just bet bigger amounts, I could win back what I'd lost. The gambler's fallacy, I observed. I didn't see it that way at the time, Blake continued, his voice shaking now. I thought I was smart enough that I understood the odds better than other people. By the time I realized I had a real problem, I was already in too deep. How deep? Blake took a shaky breath. 200,000. This was 3 years ago, while Janelle was still healthy before the cancer. I went to some people I shouldn't have, people who loan money at rates that should be illegal. I told myself I'd pay them back quickly, that I just needed time to get back on my feet and win some of it back. But you kept gambling. I couldn't help it. Blake's voice cracked. Every time I got a little bit ahead, I'd think just one more bet, just one more win, and I could pay everything off at once. But the losses kept mounting. And the interest on what I'd borrowed kept compounding. 200 became 300, 300 became 500, then 850. And you didn't tell Janelle. How could I? She was fighting cancer, going through chemotherapy, radiation. She didn't need to know that her husband was a degenerate gambler who was destroying their financial future. So I lied. I told her business was slow, that we needed to be careful with money, all while I was bleeding us dry at casinos and sports books. James Franklin spoke for the first time since Blake had arrived. Mr. Morrison, did you use any of Mr. Carter's money he sent to help with household expenses and Janelle's medical bills to fund your gambling? Blake's silence was answer enough. You took money I sent for my daughter's cancer treatment, I said slowly, each word deliberate, and you gambled it away. Not all of it, Blake said desperately. Most of it went to her care, I swear. But sometimes when I was sure I had a sure thing, when I was certain I could win, I'd use a little bit. I always planned to put it back before anyone noticed. I was going to win big and replace it, and nobody would ever know. But you never did. No, Blake whispered. I never did. What happened after Janelle died, I asked, not turning around. Did your gambling get better or worse? Blake's voice was barely audible. It got worse. The gambling became an escape from the grief, from the guilt. Every time I'd sit at a slot machine or place a bet for those few minutes, I wouldn't have to think about losing her, about being alone. The debt kept growing. 200 became 500, became 850. The interest compounds weekly. These people don't care about excuses or sob stories, and that's when you hired Heritage Investigations. Yes, Blake admitted. I was desperate. I thought maybe there was some hidden asset through Janelle's family. Maybe you had a life insurance policy or a pension I could access. Maybe there was property somewhere. I was looking for anything that could save me. And what did you find? Blake looked up at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. I found out you're George Washington Carter Jr., son of George Washington Carter, senior founder of Carter Manufacturing. I found out that the old black man I threw out of my house, the man I called, that word, is actually worth $3.8 billion. I found out that my salvation was right there in my house the whole time, and I threw him away. When did you realize this? 2 weeks ago. The envelope arrived from Heritage Investigations with all the documentation. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I could think about was that I'd thrown out a billionaire, that I'd used racist language against a man who could have solved all my problems with what amounts to a rounding error in his bank account. That my only salvation was the person I'd abused in the worst possible way. And you thought if you could just find me, you could convince me to help you. Blake nodded miserably. I thought if I could just talk to you, explain that I was grieving, that I didn't mean it, that we're family. I thought maybe you'd have mercy. Let me tell you a story, Blake, I said, standing and walking back to the window. My father was born in 1920 in rural South Carolina. He grew up during Jim Crow. He watched his own father, my grandfather, get lynched by a white mob for the crime of starting a small business that competed with white merchants. He was 12 years old when he saw his father hanged from a tree. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He served in World War II in a segregated unit. I continued fighting for a country that treated him as less than human. After the war, he came home and started a small machine shop with money he'd saved from his military service. The banks wouldn't loan to black men, so he built it himself, tool by tool, customer by customer. White business owners tried to drive him out. The Klan burned down his first workshop, destroyed everything he'd built. But he rebuilt. He persisted. He succeeded. And in 1950, he had a wife and a son. Me. I turned to face Blake. But my mother couldn't handle the pressure, the constant threats, the fear. She took me and ran, changed my name, told me my father was dead. And my father spent the next 40 years searching for me while building one of the most successful black-owned companies in American history. Every patent he filed, every contract he won, every dollar he made, it was all driven by the hope that someday his son would come home. I pulled out my father's letter and slid it across the table to Blake. Read it. Blake's hands trembled as he picked up the letter. I watched his eyes move across the page, saw the moment he understood the depth of my father's love, the magnitude of what he had built, the decades of searching and hoping and never giving up. When Blake finished reading, he looked up at me with something like hope in his eyes. Then you understand, George. You understand what it's like to lose everything, to have your life destroyed by circumstances. You understand... No, I interrupted. I understand what it's like to build something despite overwhelming obstacles. I understand what it's like to face racism and discrimination and keep pushing forward anyway. I understand what my father understood, that black excellence isn't about wealth, it's about dignity. It's about refusing to let others define your worth. George, please. Let me tell you what else I understand, I said, my voice hardening. I understand that my father put a clause in his will specifically to protect his legacy from people like you, people who would exploit it, people who would treat his family with disrespect and contempt. James Franklin slid a document across the table. This is the relevant section of George Washington Carter Sr.'s will. Please read subsection 7, paragraph 3. Blake's eyes scanned the page, and I watched his face go from pale to gray. No, this can't be right. Any person who mistreats, abuses, or shows disrespect to George Washington Carter Jr. or his descendants shall be permanently barred from any financial benefit from the Carter estate, I recited from memory. That's the clause, Blake. And your treatment of me, the racist language you used, the abuse, the way you threw me out onto the street on the day of my daughter's funeral, all of that clearly and unambiguously qualifies as mistreatment and abuse. But I didn't know who you were, Blake protested desperately. If I'd known... That's exactly the point, I said, my voice like steel now. You treated me that way because you thought I was powerless. You thought I was just an old black man with nothing to offer. You thought you could abuse me without consequences because I didn't matter to you. You showed me your true racist face when you believed there would be no price to pay for it. Blake's eyes were wide with panic. George, you can't do this. You can't let me die over a mistake. $850,000 is nothing to you. You're worth billions. You could save me and never even notice the money was gone. You're right, I said. I could write that check right now, and it would mean nothing to my net worth. But that's not the point, is it? Then what is the point? Blake was nearly shouting now. What do you want from me? I apologized. I admitted I was wrong. What more do you want? I want you to understand something, Blake. I stood up, placing my hands on the table and leaning toward him. Respect isn't something you give only when someone has power or money. Respect is something you give because people are human beings with dignity and worth regardless of their circumstances. You used racial slurs against me. You threw me out on the day of my daughter's funeral. You erased Janelle's memory from your home within weeks, bringing another woman into her house while she was barely cold in the ground. And you did all of that because you thought your whiteness and your position gave you the right to treat an elderly black man however you wanted, without consequences. George And now I continued, you've discovered that the powerless old black man you abused is actually worth billions. And you want me to save you because suddenly I matter. Suddenly I have value. Suddenly I deserve respect. But it's too late, Blake. The respect I needed was that night when you threw me out. The kindness I needed was when I was sleeping in my car. The humanity I deserved was before you knew who I really was. Blake was crying now, tears streaming down his face. Please, George, I'm begging you. These people will kill me. I have 4 days left. 4 days and I'm dead. You're the only person who can save me. No, I said quietly. I'm the only person who could have saved you. Past tense. Because the moment you abused me, you triggered that will clause. And that clause is absolute and irrevocable. Amanda spoke up. Mr. Morrison, even if Mr. Carter wanted to help you, which he's made very clear he does not, he is legally prohibited from doing so. Any financial benefit extended to you would violate the terms of his father's will and could jeopardize Mr. Carter's entire inheritance. The clause was designed specifically to prevent exactly what you're attempting now, exploiting Mr. Carter's wealth after having mistreated him. Blake turned to James Franklin, grasping for any hope. There has to be something, some legal workaround, some way to— There isn't, James said firmly. The will is ironclad. 3 separate legal teams have reviewed it over the decades. The language is clear and unambiguous. You are permanently barred from any benefit from the Carter estate. There is no appeal process, no exceptions, no loopholes. What's done is done. Blake's face crumpled completely. Then I'm dead. You're sentencing me to death. No, I said, walking toward the door. You sentenced yourself. Every racist word you used, every cruel action you took, every moment you treated me as less than human because you thought I was powerless, those were your choices, Blake. Those were your decisions. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. I paused at the door and looked back one last time. You know what the saddest part is, Blake? If you had just been kind, if you had just let me stay in the house and grieve my daughter in peace, none of this would be happening. You'd have access to more money than you could ever need. Your debts would be nothing. Your life would be secure. But you couldn't do it. You couldn't show basic human decency to an old black man because your racism was stronger than your common sense. And that racism has destroyed you more thoroughly than any creditor ever could. Blake lurched to his feet. You can't do this. I was married to your daughter. I'm family. Janelle loved me. You dishonored my daughter's memory. I said, my voice cold now. You threw out her belongings like trash. You brought another woman into her home weeks after her death, and you abused her father because you thought he was worthless. Janelle would be ashamed of the man you've become, Blake. Ashamed that she ever loved you. George, please. Blake was begging now, reaching toward me across the table. I'll do anything. I'll give you the house. I'll give you everything I own. Just save my life. Everything you own. I smiled without humor. Blake, let me tell you something else. That house you've been living in, the one you thought was yours, I bought it 3 days ago. Paid cash. It's mine now, along with everything in it. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Blake staggered backward. What, the house was in foreclosure? You haven't paid the mortgage in 3 months. The bank was preparing to seize it. I bought it from them at a discount. So everything you own already belongs to me, and I'm giving you 3 days to remove your personal belongings. Anything left behind will be disposed of. You can't? I can, and I have, I said. The eviction notice will be delivered this afternoon. Blake turned to the lawyers, desperate for someone to tell him this wasn't happening. They remained silent, professional, unmoved by his panic. One more thing, Blake, I said, opening the door. The black community in our old neighborhood, they've been protecting me from you for 2 weeks. Every person you asked for help, every door you knocked on, every $50 you offered, they all refused you. Not because they didn't know where I was, but because they knew what you'd done to me. Mrs. Patterson coordinated the neighborhood watch. The Johnsons documented your racist rants. Pastor Williams recorded your harassment. Pete Johnson reported every desperate conversation. They all protected me because that's what community does. We protect our elders from people like you. I stepped into the hallway. Blake Morrison, white man who thought marrying a black woman gave him permission to abuse her black father, was learning the hardest lesson of his life. That power isn't about money or race or position. Power is about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. Goodbye, Blake. I hope the next 4 days teach you something about humility and respect, though I doubt they will. His screaming followed me down the hallway. George, please. You can't leave me like this, George. George, you can't just let them kill me. I kept walking, my head high, my shoulders back, my father's ring solid and real on my finger. Amanda and James flanked me, a protective presence, as we walked to the elevator. When we reached the lobby, Amanda turned to me. How do you feel, Mr. Carter? I thought about the question. How did I feel? Not triumphant, exactly. Not even satisfied, though there was some of that. Mostly, I felt free. Free from the burden of caring what racists thought of me. Free from the shame of being discarded. Free from the belief that my worth was determined by my circumstances rather than my character. I feel like I can finally breathe, I said. Like I've been carrying a weight for 6 weeks and now it's gone. James smiled. You handled that with remarkable dignity, Mr. Carter. Your father would be proud. We stepped out onto the street. Atlanta spread before me, the city where I'd taught history for 40 years, where I'd raised my daughter, where I'd been broken and rebuilt into something stronger. Blake Morrison had tried to destroy me with his racism and cruelty, but he'd failed. And in failing, he'd destroyed himself instead. I was free. And Blake, racist and cruel, would spend his last 4 days learning what I'd always known, that dignity isn't given by others, it's claimed by yourself. And once claimed, no amount of hatred or contempt can take it away. Justice, I was learning, wasn't always swift, but when it finally arrived, it was absolute. 6 months later, I sat on the deck of my new home in Hilton Head Island, watching the Atlantic Ocean roll endlessly toward the shore. The house was beautiful but not ostentatious, a comfortable cottage with wraparound porches and views that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was exactly what I needed after the chaos and transformation of the past months. The morning sun was warm on my face as I sipped coffee from a simple ceramic mug. Nothing fancy, just good coffee and quiet peace. This was real wealth, I had learned. Not the mansions or the cars or the designer suits, though I had access to all of that now. Real wealth was the freedom to sit in silence and watch the ocean without fear, without worry, without anyone trying to take it from you or diminish your right to enjoy it. My phone buzzed with the morning briefing from Carter Manufacturing headquarters in Atlanta. As chairman of the board, I received daily updates on operations, though I'd chosen to take a hands-off approach to the day-to-day management. The company had thrived for decades under excellent leadership, and I saw no reason to disrupt what was working. My role was to provide vision and values to ensure that my father's legacy continued to honor the principles he'd built it on. The company was doing extraordinarily well. Better than well, actually. Once the news broke about the lost heir being found, after 57 years, investor confidence had surged dramatically. Our stock price had jumped 23% in the first quarter alone. New contracts were flowing in from companies that wanted to be associated with our story of perseverance and black excellence. The board had voted unanimously to rename our scholarship program the George Washington Carter Senior Memorial Scholarship Fund, awarding full rides to promising black students pursuing engineering and business degrees at HBCUs across the South. But my real passion project, the work that got me out of bed each morning with purpose and fire in my heart, was the Janelle Carter Foundation. I'd endowed it with $100 million dedicated to breast cancer research and support specifically for Black women battling the disease that had taken my daughter from me. The foundation had already made significant strides in just 6 months. We'd partnered with Emory University and Morehouse School of Medicine, providing a $20 million grant for research into why Black women died from breast cancer at significantly higher rates than any other demographic. The research team was conducting clinical trials specifically designed for African American patients, studying genetic markers and environmental factors that might explain the disparity. We'd also launched a mobile mammography program, putting 15 state-of-the-art screening units on the road across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. These units traveled to underserved neighborhoods, churches, community centers, anywhere Black women gathered, offering free screenings with no questions asked, no insurance required, no barriers to access. In the first 6 months alone, we'd screened over 12,000 women. We'd detected 47 cases of early-stage cancer that might otherwise have gone undiagnosed until it was too late. I kept a folder of letters from women whose lives had been saved by our program. Your foundation saved my life. One letter read, written in careful handwriting on flowered stationery, "I'm Patricia Johnson from Atlanta. I couldn't afford screening. My insurance wouldn't cover it. I kept putting it off, telling myself I felt fine, that I was probably worrying over nothing. But when your mobile unit came to my church, I decided to get checked. They found a tumor. Caught it early. I'm cancer-free now because we caught it in time. Thank you for giving me the chance to see my grandchildren grow up." Another letter from Maria Washington in Savannah brought tears to my eyes every time I read it. I'm a single mother of 3. When I was diagnosed, I thought I'd have to choose between getting treatment and feeding my kids, between saving my life and keeping a roof over our heads. The Janelle Carter Foundation made sure I didn't have to choose. They covered my chemotherapy, my radiation, my surgery. They provided transportation to appointments. They even helped with childcare while I was too sick to care for my babies. I'm alive today because someone decided Black women's lives matter enough to invest in saving them. The foundation had also established 18 survivor support groups across 3 states, led by survivors and trained therapists who understood the unique challenges Black women faced when battling cancer. The emotional toll, the financial stress, the impact on families, the way our community often expected us to be strong and silent about our suffering. We'd launched education and prevention programs, teaching self-examination techniques in high schools and community centers, distributing 50,000 educational booklets through Black churches, running a social media campaign with the hashtag Janelle's Legacy that was reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Just last month, a foundation-funded study had been published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The research team had identified 3 genetic markers that appeared more frequently in Black women with aggressive forms of breast cancer. This discovery could potentially lead to targeted treatments that would save thousands of lives in the coming years. Dr. Kenya Williams, the lead researcher, had called me personally to share the news. Mr. Carter, the Janelle Carter Foundation's funding, allowed us to conduct research that pharmaceutical companies wouldn't fund because the market wasn't considered profitable enough. We're changing outcomes for thousands of women because you decided their lives were worth investing in. Your daughter's legacy is literally saving lives. Beyond the foundation, I'd also funded 3 new homeless shelters in Atlanta. The flagship facility, built on the site of the old Riverside shelter, was state-of-the-art. 120 beds in private rooms, not metal cots in a warehouse. Job training programs that taught resume writing, interview skills, and offered certification courses in trades like plumbing, electrical work, and HVAC repair. A mental health clinic staffed by 3 therapists and a psychiatrist. A medical clinic with a nurse practitioner who could treat common ailments and prescribe medications. We'd named it the Janelle Carter Hope Center, and Pastor David Williams ran the programs there with the same compassion he'd shown me during my darkest days. In 6 months, 67% of residents had secured stable housing and employment. We were changing lives, breaking cycles, giving people dignity and hope. I'd gotten a letter just last week from Dennis Crawford, a 62-year-old man who'd been staying at the old Riverside shelter when I was there. "Mr. Carter, I was where you were, thrown away by family who decided I wasn't worth keeping around. I was sleeping on that same cot you slept on, listening to Gerald cough, thinking my life was over. The Janelle Carter Hope Center gave me more than a bed. It gave me my dignity back. I went through the electrical certification program. Now I have my own apartment and I'm working as a licensed electrician. You didn't just give me a handout, you gave me a hand up. Thank you for remembering where you came from and helping those of us still trying to find our way out." We'd opened 2 additional centers, one in Decatur focused specifically on homeless veterans, and another in College Park designed for families with children who'd fallen through the cracks. Ruth Jackson had moved into the cottage next to mine 2 months ago. Not as a romantic partner people often assumed wrong, but as a dear friend who had shown me kindness when I had absolutely nothing to offer in return. She'd sold her small house in Atlanta and embraced this new chapter of life with the same grace and warmth she'd shown me that day in Riverside Park when she'd offered me half her sandwich. We'd developed a comfortable routine, separate houses, separate lives, but dinner together most evenings on my deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that never got old. She was someone to talk to about the strangeness of going from homeless to billionaire in a matter of weeks, someone who'd known me before the money and treated me exactly the same after it. Over breakfast that morning, Ruth had scrolled through her tablet catching up on news. "Oh," she said, glancing up at me, "there's an update about Blake Morrison." I'd been following his situation from a distance, not out of concern, but out of curiosity about how his story would end, whether he'd learn anything from the catastrophe he'd created for himself. "What's the latest?" I asked, spreading jam on my toast. Ruth read from the article. Blake Morrison, the man who lost access to billions after abusing his elderly father-in-law, has declared bankruptcy and relocated to Tampa, Florida. He's currently working at a car rental agency under an assumed name to avoid creditors. The article says he managed to reach a settlement with his creditors for pennies on the dollar after it became clear he had no assets and no way to pay. "So he survived," I said quietly. Ruth looked at me over her reading glasses, disappointed. "No," I said honestly. "I never wanted him dead. I just wanted him to understand consequences." "Sounds like he's living them every day." The article goes on, Ruth continued. Says he's living in a studio apartment working for minimum wage, still hiding from some of the people he owes money to. It's not the death sentence he feared, but it's certainly not the life he expected to be living at 50 years old. That's the thing about rock bottom, I observed. Sometimes surviving it is worse than not surviving it. Every day he wakes up in that studio apartment, he'll remember the house he had. Every time he cashes his minimum wage paycheck, he'll remember the billions he threw away. That's a special kind of torture, living with the knowledge of what you lost through your own choices. "You're not as forgiving as you pretend to be," Ruth said with a slight smile. "I'm not pretending anything," I replied. I forgave Blake for my own peace of mind, not for his benefit. Forgiveness doesn't mean I have to save him from his choices or forget what he did. It just means I'm not carrying the weight of hatred anymore. After breakfast, I walked down to the beach alone, my bare feet sinking into the cool sand. I'd brought something with me, a letter I'd written to Janelle months ago but never sent because there was nowhere to send it to. I sat on a piece of driftwood that had washed up on shore and read it one more time. "Dearest Janelle, I wish you could see what's happened. Your daddy, the history teacher you worried about after your mama died, turns out to be the son of George Washington Carter Sr., one of the great black entrepreneurs of our time. I wish you'd known your grandfather. I wish I'd known him. But his legacy lives on through me now, through the foundation in your name, through the communities we're helping, through the lives we're saving. Blake showed his true self after you were gone. The racism that was always there, hidden behind the progressive image of marrying a black woman, came out the moment he thought I was powerless. But I'm okay now, baby girl. Better than okay. I'm free. Your death broke my heart. Blake's cruelty nearly broke my spirit. But discovering who I really am, who we really are, that healed me in ways I didn't know I needed. I love you, and I promise I'll make our family name mean something again. Your father always, George Washington Carter Jr." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my pocket. Some conversations didn't need to be sent to be real. Some words existed in the heart where the people we'd lost could still hear them. My phone rang. It was James Franklin with a final update on the Blake situation. "Mr. Carter, I have the last piece of information you requested. The house in Cascade Heights has been fully renovated as you specified. We've donated it to the nonprofit that provides transitional housing for elderly homeless individuals just as you wanted. The Janelle Carter Transitional Home will house 6 residents at a time, providing them with dignity and support as they rebuild their lives." "Perfect," I said. "And Blake's belongings that he left behind, disposed of as you instructed," James confirmed. though I should mention we found several boxes of your daughter's possessions that Blake had stored in the attic instead of throwing away as he'd claimed. Photo albums, artwork, personal items. We've placed everything in climate-controlled storage for you. My throat tightened with emotion. Thank you, James. That means more than you know. One more thing, James continued. The board meeting is scheduled for next month. They're hoping you'll attend in person this time to meet the executive team and tour the facilities. I'll be there, I promised. It's time I saw my father's company up close, time I understood fully what he built and what he wanted me to carry forward. After hanging up, I stood at the water's edge, letting the waves wash over my feet. 6 months ago, I'd been sleeping on a cot in a shelter, wondering if I'd die forgotten and alone. Now I was the chairman of a multi-billion-dollar company, living in a beautiful home, using my resources to help communities that looked like mine, honoring my father's legacy and my daughter's memory. But the most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't the money or the power or the respect that came with wealth. It was the understanding that my worth had never been tied to my bank account. I'd been valuable when I was teaching history for 40 years. I'd been valuable when I was sleeping in my car. I'd been valuable when I was sweeping church steps for $50 a day. Blake had tried to strip that value away with his racism and cruelty. But he'd failed. Because dignity isn't something that can be given or taken by others. It's something you claim for yourself and refuse to surrender regardless of circumstances. That evening, Ruth and I sat on my deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. We didn't talk much, just enjoyed the peace of being two old friends who'd survived their own storms and found a quiet harbor. You know what I've learned, I said, finally breaking the comfortable silence. Black excellence doesn't need white validation. My father built an empire without waiting for white people to approve of him or give him permission. He created wealth and power in a system that was designed to keep him poor and powerless. And he did it with dignity, with purpose, with the knowledge that his worth wasn't determined by anyone's opinion of him. Ruth raised her glass of sweet tea. To George Washington Carter Sr., and to his son, who finally came home. We clinked glasses as the sun sank below the horizon. Somewhere in Florida, Blake Morrison was probably clocking out of his shift at a car rental agency, returning to a studio apartment, living with the consequences of his choices. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, but I felt no guilt either. Some lessons could only be learned through loss. Blake had lost everything because he'd treated dignity as something only wealthy people deserved respect, as something only powerful people had earned. Now he was learning what I'd always known. That dignity was the one thing poverty couldn't take away, and wealth couldn't provide if you didn't already possess it within yourself. As darkness fell over Hilton Head Island, I sat in peace, surrounded by the wealth my father had built, carrying forward the legacy he'd intended for me all along. Not just money, but purpose. Not just power, but responsibility. Not just success, but service to those who needed it most. I was finally home, not just to a place, but to myself, to the man I was supposed to be before my mother's fear had hidden me away, to the son my father had searched for across decades, to the teacher, the father, the man who understood that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in dignity, not in possessions, but in purpose, not in what you owned, but in what you gave away. The journey from that Walmart parking lot to this ocean view had been longer than 6 months. It had been 76 years, but I'd finally arrived. And Blake Morrison, wherever he was, had taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that you can lose everything material and still have everything that matters. Or you can have access to everything material and lose it all through your own cruelty and hate. I chose dignity, Blake chose racism, and we both got exactly what we deserved. This story reveals a painful truth about racism in America. It often hides behind progressive facades until the mask slips. Blake's racism wasn't created when he threw George out. It was always there, concealed behind the image of marrying a black woman, waiting for the moment when he thought he could show his true face without consequences. The cruel irony is that Blake destroyed himself not through his racism alone, but through his assumption that a black elder had no power, no value, no recourse. He judged George's worth by his circumstances and skin color, never imagining the truth beneath the surface. George Washington Carter Sr. understood something essential about protecting black wealth in a country built on exploitation. His will clause wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. He knew that racism often manifests as exploitation. and he built protections accordingly, ensuring that anyone who showed disrespect would be permanently barred from benefiting. The lesson isn't that money solves racism. George was the same dignified man homeless as he was wealthy. The lesson is about recognizing human worth beyond economic status, respecting elders regardless of circumstances, and understanding that cruelty has consequences that can't be undone. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for justice, that dignity matters more than money, and that cruelty always has consequences. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to stand up to someone who disrespected you because of your age, race, or circumstances? What happened? How did you reclaim your power? Remember, dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away. It's something you claim for yourself and refuse to surrender no matter what. Thank you for watching.